In the depths of history, there are moments, fragments of time, so elusive, so utterly lost, that they defy explanation. Entire hours, even days, vanishing without a trace. What happened in those gaps? What did we miss, and why can't we seem to find the answers? From ancient civilizations to modern mysteries, these unexplained absences haunt the chronicles of time, leaving behind more questions than answers. Today, we journey into those shadows, into the vast, unsettling void of history. So sit back, relax, and let's dive in. Beneath the sun-drenched skies of Cyprus, the remnants of a once thriving Bronze Age civilization lie scattered across the land, weathered by centuries of time and shifting tides. The island, rich with fertile soil and a strategic position in the eastern Mediterranean, was home to thriving city-states during the height of its power. Yet, amidst the vibrant ruins, one mystery stands out: an unexplained gap in time, a sudden and eerie disappearance of entire settlements, leaving behind a trail of abandoned structures and shattered pottery. This was the Abandonment Gap of the Late Bronze Age. At the peak of the 12th century BC, Cyprus was a center of culture and commerce. Its cities, such as Enkomi, Kition, and Paphos, were hubs of trade, connected to the great civilizations of Egypt, the Near East, and the Aegean. Archaeological evidence reveals a flourishing society: elaborate temples, intricate pottery, finely crafted jewelry, and a network of urban infrastructure that showcased a people in their prime. And then, almost as if a switch had been flipped, the bustling cities were abandoned, seemingly overnight. The exact cause of this sudden departure is unknown, though historians have long speculated. Was it the result of a natural disaster? The island sits along a major fault line, and earthquakes were certainly not uncommon in ancient times. Some theories suggest that a catastrophic tremor could have caused widespread destruction, leaving the people of Cyprus with no choice but to abandon their homes. Yet, there is little evidence of structural collapse on a large enough scale to explain the complete evacuation of these settlements. Others point to external forces: war, invasion, or piracy. The 12th century BC was a time of turmoil across the Mediterranean, as great empires crumbled and new powers rose to take their place. The mysterious Sea Peoples, a group of maritime raiders, are often cited as the culprits behind the widespread disruption. Did they sweep through Cyprus, burning cities and driving the inhabitants to flee? Evidence of destruction in some parts of the island could lend some weight to this theory, but the abandonment of entire urban centers remains curiously abrupt. And if invasion were truly the cause, why would the people of Cyprus not leave behind more signs of conflict: fortifications, weapons, or the remains of battle? Some archaeologists suggest that internal strife, perhaps fueled by social upheaval or a breakdown in trade networks, could have prompted the abandonment. The once thriving Cypriot cities relied heavily on the import of raw materials like metals and textiles. Was a sudden collapse in these trade routes, perhaps due to the weakening of neighboring empires, enough to unravel the fabric of Cypriot society? Could the people, faced with economic instability, simply have chosen to leave for a better future elsewhere? Yet another theory, one that leans more into the speculative realm, suggests that something far stranger may have been at play. Could there have been a religious or cultural shift, a collective decision to leave behind everything and migrate to unknown lands in search of a new life or spiritual salvation? The Bronze Age, after all, was a time of great upheaval and transformation across the Mediterranean. The fall of once great empires, such as the Mycenaean Greeks and the Hittites, has long been seen as the result of a series of interconnected crises, both man-made and natural. But might something even more enigmatic, an esoteric belief or event, have prompted the abandonment of these cities? The mystery deepens when we consider the archaeological record. While some towns were completely deserted, others, like the city of Kition, seem to have experienced only partial depopulation. Was there a gradual exodus, or did a small fraction of the population remain, leaving behind traces of their presence in the form of symbolic artifacts? The ruins of the city of Enkomi, for example, reveal a sudden cessation of pottery production, as if the workshops simply stopped operating. The pottery found in these final layers shows signs of hurried abandonment, unfinished pieces, broken fragments, and marks that suggest a community that, at some point, lost its way. Yet, in the grand tapestry of history, these questions remain largely unanswered. As time moves forward, the search for answers continues, but the true reasons behind the abandonment gap remain elusive. Was it a natural disaster, an invasion, economic collapse, or something more mysterious? The ruins of Cyprus whisper their secrets, but they refuse to offer a clear explanation. And so, as the winds sweep across the quiet remains of these ancient cities, the question lingers. What happened to the people of Bronze Age Cyprus? What caused their cities to fall silent, their streets to empty, and their homes to be left behind? The answers may never come, but the mystery, ever haunting, still beckons those who seek to uncover the forgotten chapters of history. As we leave behind the sun-bleached ruins of Cyprus, with its ancient, abandoned cities and unanswered questions, we turn our gaze to another enigmatic chapter of history, one that stretches back to the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates, to the land that once cradled the earliest known civilization. Here, in the heart of Mesopotamia, the mystery of the Neo-Sumerian Administrative Silence unfolds. Around 2000 BC, in what we now call southern Iraq, the mighty Sumerian Empire reached its zenith under the rule of the third dynasty of Ur. The city of Ur, with its grand ziggurat towering above the Euphrates, was a beacon of power and culture. It was a time when vast administrative records, carved in clay, inked on papyrus, and recorded on intricate cylinder seals, offered a glimpse into the bureaucratic machinery that kept the empire running smoothly. Temples and palaces flourished, and the vast resources of the empire were carefully accounted for, their flow monitored by a well-organized system of scribes, merchants, and governors. Yet, after the fall of the Ur Third Dynasty in the 19th century BC, something strange occurred. The vibrant network of administrative records, so prevalent in the centuries before, ceased almost entirely. The vast archives of the Ur Third Dynasty, which had meticulously catalogued everything from land grants to commercial transactions, abruptly stopped. It was as though an invisible hand had silenced the once bustling halls of Sumerian governance. The reasons behind this sudden disappearance of written records remain a source of great mystery. Was it simply the result of the empire's collapse? The fall of Ur III was followed by decades of political instability, invasions, and warfare, especially from the Amorites and Elamites. It's possible that the chaos of the time led to the destruction or loss of these records, but the lack of surviving documentation raises questions. Why did such an advanced civilization, known for its record-keeping, fail to leave behind a historical trace during this period? In the immediate aftermath of the collapse, the region was divided into several smaller, often warring city-states. Some historians argue that the administrative systems simply became less formal, less centralized. With the fall of Ur, the power of the king was no longer absolute, and local leaders may have no longer seen the need for the same level of meticulous record-keeping. But could the disappearance of the records have been more deliberate, a conscious choice to erase the past? Some scholars suggest that this silence might be linked to the rise of the Amorites, who eventually founded the Babylonian Empire. The Amorites, hailing from the western fringes of Mesopotamia, were known for their pastoralist lifestyle and their disdain for the Sumerian urban system. Did they, upon assuming power, purposefully abandon the practices of their predecessors. The shift from the detailed, methodical documentation of the Sumerians to the relative sparseness of records during the early Babylonian period could point to a deliberate cultural shift. But, if so, why did they choose to silence the records of Ur, which were not just bureaucratic but also religious and cultural? There are other theories, more speculative in nature, that point to an event or series of events that led to this sudden break in continuity. Some have suggested that the Sumerians' loss of administrative records could have been the result of an internal revolution, a backlash against the centralized authority of the Ur Third Dynasty. Could a radical faction, seeking to dismantle the old power structures, have destroyed the archives to erase the very memory of the old regime? It's a possibility, though no direct evidence supports this theory. And then there are the more fringe speculations, ideas that delve into the realm of the unknown. Some have even suggested that the administrative silence might be linked to a more mysterious cause, an event of such cosmic or metaphysical significance that it altered the course of history itself. Could a natural disaster, like an earthquake, have destroyed not just the city of Ur, but the very fabric of its bureaucratic systems? The region is known to be prone to seismic activity, and some have argued that an event of such magnitude could have caused widespread devastation. Could a loss of knowledge, and perhaps even language, have occurred in the wake of such a disaster, leaving the people of Mesopotamia to rebuild with a different set of priorities? Others entertain even more speculative ideas, such as the influence of foreign, possibly otherworldly forces, ideas that blur the line between myth and history. Ancient texts such as the Epic of Gilgamesh, which dates back to this period, speak of gods and cosmic events that shape the lives of men. Could the sudden absence of records be linked to a religious or cultural transformation? Were the people of post-Ur Mesopotamia, in their quest for survival, rejecting their former gods, the ones who had presided over the grand temples and bureaucracies? The idea that an entire society could abandon its system of documentation, its history, its gods, is deeply unsettling. But the evidence for this remains as elusive as the answers themselves. Despite the many theories, one thing remains clear. The Neo-Sumerian Administrative Silence, the sudden disappearance of written records after the fall of Ur III, represents one of the great mysteries of ancient history. Was it the result of political upheaval, cultural transformation, or something more enigmatic? Why did a civilization known for its written records and historical continuity fall silent at such a pivotal moment? As we look across the centuries, the silence remains, and the question endures. What happened to the records of Ur? What did we lose in that great gap? And what might still be hidden beneath the sands of time, waiting to be uncovered? As we leave behind the enigmatic silence that followed the fall of Ur and continue our journey through history's unexplained gaps, we turn our attention to another puzzle from the ancient world, one that echoes across the mountains and plains of Anatolia. Here, nestled in the fertile valleys and rugged landscapes of modern-day Turkey, lies the mystery of the Assyrian trade colonies. These thriving outposts, established by the Assyrian Empire during the 2nd millennium BC, once formed a vital part of the ancient world's network of commerce. Yet, much like the sudden disappearance of written records in Sumer, the collapse of these colonies remains an enduring enigma. At the heart of this mystery lies the site of Kultepe, an ancient trading hub that stood as a beacon of Assyrian influence in Anatolia. Kultepe, known to the Assyrians as Karum Kanesh, was a bustling commercial center, strategically positioned at the crossroads of vital trade routes. It was here, amidst the remnants of brick walls and weathered inscriptions, that the Assyrians established one of their most important colonies. Archaeological excavations have revealed a wealth of information about the life of this once thriving trading hub. Thousands of cuneiform tablets have been uncovered, detailing the daily activities of Assyrian merchants, their dealings with local Anatolian elites, and their commercial transactions that spanned from the distant shores of the Mediterranean to the heart of Mesopotamia. These colonies were not merely outposts. They were the lifeblood of Assyria's trade network, acting as vital centers for the exchange of goods such as textiles, metalwork, and precious stones. For centuries, Kultepe and other Assyrian colonies flourished, with Assyrian merchants engaging in a complex web of economic activity. But then, as suddenly as they had appeared, these colonies began to fall silent. By the mid-18th century BC, the colonies began to experience a rapid decline. In the space of just a few decades, the once vibrant Karum Kanish and other settlements were abandoned, leaving behind a perplexing void. The cuneiform tablets, which had once chronicled the life and commerce of the Assyrian settlers, ceased abruptly, and the city fell into ruin. What caused the sudden and seemingly complete collapse of such an established and flourishing trade system? One of the most widely accepted explanations for the fall of the Assyrian trade colonies is the rise of a new and more aggressive power in the region, the Hittites. The Hittites, who were establishing their own empire in Anatolia, were known for their military prowess and strategic territorial expansion. Some scholars suggest that the Hittites, seeking to assert control over Anatolia's valuable trade routes, may have driven the Assyrians out of the region. If the Hittites had in fact attacked and overrun these colonies, it would explain the sudden and violent end to Assyrian dominance in Anatolia. Yet, while military conquest could certainly account for the abrupt decline of these colonies, it doesn't fully explain the underlying causes. Why, for example, did the Assyrian merchants fail to leave behind any significant evidence of warfare? Archaeologists have not found the traces of destruction, such as burned buildings, weapons, or the remains of a violent battle, that one might expect from an invasion. The lack of such evidence raises further questions. Was there a more subtle shift at play? Could the collapse have been the result of internal factors, such as economic disruption or political instability, rather than external conquest? Some theories suggest that the economic system of these Assyrian colonies was more fragile than it appeared. The colonies were heavily reliant on trade with the broader Assyrian Empire, and any disruption to the flow of goods or a shift in Assyrian policy could have caused them to crumble. Perhaps with the rise of new economic centers or changes in the broader geopolitical landscape, the Assyrians simply found it no longer profitable or feasible to maintain these distant outposts. Could the collapse have been a result of an internal shift within the Assyrian state, where the focus of commerce and power shifted elsewhere? Another possibility is that the Assyrian colonies were victims of a broader regional upheaval, caused by environmental factors or natural disasters. The ancient world, like today, was vulnerable to such disruptions, and Anatolia was no stranger to seismic activity and climatic shifts. Could the abandonment of the colonies be linked to drought, famine, or even an earthquake? Some have speculated that the collapse of the trade colonies may have been tied to a catastrophic event, one that left the Assyrians and their Anatolian counterparts unable to continue their trading operations. And then, there are the more fringe theories that stretch the boundaries of conventional history. Some have suggested that the collapse of the colonies might have been tied to the shifting religious or cultural landscape of the region. Could the Assyrian settlers, faced with an increasingly hostile or indifferent population, have chosen to abandon their commercial pursuits altogether? Were the Assyrians in Anatolia caught in a larger, more mystifying web of regional dynamics, perhaps a religious movement or a cultural transformation, that led to their sudden disappearance? The truth, as is so often the case with ancient mysteries, may never be fully understood. What caused the collapse of the Assyrian trade colonies in Anatolia? Was it military conquest, internal economic collapse, or something more elusive, perhaps even a combination of all of these factors? And what was lost in those final years of abandonment? The economic networks, the cultural exchange, the human stories, that we may never fully recover? As we piece together the fragments of this ancient mystery, the collapse of the Assyrian trade colonies remains an unanswered question, its silence as perplexing as the ruins that remain. As we continue our journey through time, moving from the collapse of Assyrian trade colonies to another perplexing gap in history, we find ourselves in the ancient heart of China. It is here, among the remnants of the Shang dynasty, that an unsettling silence has intrigued historians and archaeologists for centuries. Known for its advanced bronze work, intricate rituals, and early forms of Chinese writing, the Shang dynasty, circa 1600 BC to 1046 BC, remains a beacon of early Chinese civilization. Yet, there exists a mysterious and unexplained gap in the records from its earliest period, one that continues to defy understanding. Our story begins in the Anyang region of modern-day Henan province, where the final Shang capital, Yinshu, was uncovered in the early 20th century. Here, among the ruins, archaeologists unearthed a wealth of artifacts, bronze vessels, jade ornaments, and perhaps most famously, the bones and shells inscribed with the earliest form of Chinese writing, oracle bones. These bones and tortoise shells, carved with divinatory inscriptions, offered scholars a direct glimpse into the mind of the Shang kings and their relationship with the gods. Through these records, we began to understand the workings of the Shang state, its kings, its ritual practices, and the role of divination in governing life and death. The writing system, though primitive, showed remarkable sophistication, and the discovery of Yinshu was hailed as one of the most significant archaeological finds of the 20th century. Yet, for all its grandeur, the Shang dynasty's records hold a strange silence, especially concerning its early period. Although the oracle bones provide a glimpse of the later Shang kings, the historical records from the beginning of the dynasty are far more elusive. This time gap, stretching from the establishment of the Shang to the rise of its final capital, remains a deep, unexplained mystery. How did the Shang dynasty evolve from a small, tribal kingdom into one of the most advanced civilizations of its time? What, if anything, happened in the centuries before the oracle bones began to document the lives of the kings? The mainstream explanation for this gap is the lack of written records from the earlier Shang period. While the oracle bones provide a wealth of information from the late Shang dynasty, there is little surviving evidence from the initial centuries of the dynasty's existence. Archaeologists have yet to uncover earlier inscriptions, leading some to suggest that the writing system simply had not yet developed to the point where it could be used to record history in a systematic way. But this explanation raises further questions. How could a civilization as advanced as the Shang have lacked written records during such a critical time in its formation? And if their writing system had not yet fully developed, what were they using to document their history? Or was history simply not being recorded at all? The absence of written records has led some historians to look for other forms of evidence to explain the early Shang period. Some point to the archaeological record, where evidence of early Shang settlements, ritual sites, and bronze artifacts has been found. These artifacts suggest that the Shang were highly skilled in metallurgy and art, with complex social structures and religious practices. However, these material remains, while impressive, do not provide a clear narrative of the dynasty's origins or early rulers. It is as though the first centuries of the Shang dynasty were lost in the haze of time, with no written accounts to bring them into focus. One of the more speculative theories surrounding this gap involves the possibility of a pre-Shang culture, one that existed before the rise of the Shang as a unified kingdom. Could the early Shang have been part of a larger, older cultural continuum whose records were lost to time? Some have suggested that the Xia dynasty, long considered a myth in Chinese historiography, may have had a connection to the Shang. According to ancient texts, like the records of the Grand Historian by Sima Qian, the Xia was the first dynasty in Chinese history, predating the Shang. But while the Xia is mentioned in historical texts, no physical evidence has ever been found to conclusively prove its existence. Could the early Shang have absorbed or replaced a pre-existing civilization, erasing its history and leaving only the faintest traces behind? Another theory, though more controversial, proposes that environmental factors may have played a role in the disappearance of records. The Shang dynasty's early years coincided with a period of significant environmental change, including shifting river patterns and climatic fluctuations. Could these disruptions have caused a collapse or migration of early Shang peoples, leading to a loss of written knowledge? The idea that climate change or natural disasters played a role in the disruption of early Shang society is not without merit. Several ancient Chinese dynasties, including the Zhou, are known to have faced environmental challenges that may have contributed to their downfall. Yet, in the case of the Shang, no direct evidence of such a catastrophe has been found, leaving this theory as little more than speculation. Even more intriguing is the possibility of cultural amnesia, the idea that the Shang rulers deliberately erased or suppressed their early history. Could the dynasty's founders have sought to distance themselves from their past, possibly to legitimize their rule by portraying themselves as an entirely new and divine line of kings? This theory is not as far-fetched as it may seem, as we know that many ancient civilizations practiced such historical amnesia to reinforce the power of their current rulers. In this context, the gap in early Shang records could represent a deliberate effort to craft a new narrative, one that would solidify the dynasty's claim to divine rule and erase any inconvenient truths about its origins. Yet, no matter the explanation, the gap in early Shang history persists. The oracle bones, though invaluable, only provide a snapshot of a much larger and far more complex story. The centuries that preceded them remain a shadowy void, one that scholars have yet to fully illuminate. Was there a written history that has simply been lost to time? Or did the early Shang dynasty leave behind no trace at all? As we stand before the ruins of Yinshu, gazing at the inscribed oracle bones and the remnants of a once great civilization, the question lingers. What secrets are still hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered? And how much of the Shang's early history remains forever lost in the sands of time? As we move from the mysterious gaps in early Shang history to another, equally confounding silence, we turn our attention to the great subcontinent of South Asia. Here, amidst the remnants of ancient cities and lost civilizations, lies a profound and unexplained transition, a gap in the historical record that marks the end of one of the world's earliest urban cultures and the beginning of another era. The late Harappan Early Iron Age transition. The Indus Valley Civilization, which flourished from around 3300 BC to 1300 BC, stands as one of the most advanced and enigmatic societies of the ancient world. Its cities, Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, and others, boasted sophisticated urban planning, advanced drainage systems, and a yet-to-be-deciphered script that hints at a highly organized and complex society. But then, at the turn of the second millennium BC, something unexpected occurred. The cities of the Indus Valley, once teeming with life, were abandoned almost entirely. At Mohenjo-Daro, one of the most iconic Harappan sites, the ruins lie in silence. Rows of brick houses, public baths, and granaries scattered across the desolate landscape. What happened to this thriving civilization? Why did it collapse so abruptly, and where did its people go? Was it a single catastrophic event, or a gradual unraveling, the effects of which we still struggle to understand today? The mainstream narrative suggests that the decline of the Indus Valley civilization was due to a combination of climatic shifts and tectonic activity. evidence points to possible changes in the course of the Sarasvati River, a once majestic waterway that supported much of the Indus Valley civilization's agriculture and trade. Some theories suggest that the river's drying up, combined with shifting monsoon patterns, may have triggered an environmental collapse that left the region uninhabitable for its once thriving population. Others believe that tectonic shifts, earthquakes, or other seismic events could have caused widespread damage to the cities, making them impossible to inhabit. Archaeological evidence, including signs of flooding and damaged structures, supports this theory to an extent. But even if natural forces were at play, why then did this collapse seem so complete? The cities did not simply decline, they were abandoned. The precise cause remains elusive, and the questions multiply. Did the Harappan people migrate, or were they absorbed into neighboring cultures? And if so, what happened to the intricate systems of trade, writing, and governance that had once defined their civilization? The disappearance of the Indus Valley. Civilization, however, is only half of the story. The late Harappan Early Iron Age transition, which begins around 1200 BC, marks the emergence of a new culture in South Asia, one that eventually gave rise to the early Vedic period and the formation of the kingdoms that would shape Indian history for millennia. But the gap between the fall of the Harappans and the rise of the early Iron Age is troublingly unclear. In the aftermath of the Harappan decline, the archaeological record is sparse. The region does not seem to have undergone a sudden or violent transformation, but rather a quiet shift in culture. The early Iron Age, which is traditionally associated with the arrival of iron metallurgy in the subcontinent, seems to appear almost out of nowhere. Between the end of the Harappan civilization and the rise of the early Vedic culture, there is a notable absence of evidence for a cohesive, centralizing state, at least in the archaeological record. For several centuries, it is as though history holds its breath, suspended in a silence that defies explanation. It is here, in this gap, that some of the most intriguing questions arise. While there is some evidence of continuing settlements and agricultural activities, the intricate urban planning, standardized weights, and advanced craftsmanship of the Harappans seem to vanish. The writing system that had once been used to document the Harappan world is gone. What happened to the continuity of the cultural and technological achievements of the Indus Valley people? Did these achievements fade into obscurity, or were they absorbed into new cultural forms that were simply not documented? Did the Vedic culture that eventually emerged represent a cultural rebirth or a completely new phase in South Asian history? One of the more speculative theories surrounding this transition gap involves the arrival of the Indo-Aryans, whose migration from the steppe regions to the north is believed to have influenced the early Iron Age in South Asia. Did the Indo-Aryans, as some ancient texts suggest, bring with them new technologies, new social structures, and even new languages that radically reshaped the subcontinent? The Rig Veda, the earliest of the Vedic texts, speaks of a time when the Indo-Aryans were settling in the northwestern parts of India, but it provides little direct evidence of what happened to the Harappans in the centuries before. Could the Vedic culture have emerged in response to the collapse of the Indus Valley, or was it something entirely separate? Another theory suggests that the late Harappan to early Iron Age gap could be a result of a gradual transition, a cultural shift that took place over several centuries, rather than a sudden rupture. Some scholars have proposed that the Harappan cities didn't entirely disappear. Rather, the people may have moved away from the river valleys and resettled in more dispersed rural communities. These people may have continued to live in a more decentralized manner, gradually adapting to their changing environment. It is possible that the transition from the Harappan to the Vedic period was less a collapse than an evolution into a new way of life, one that did not require large urban centers, but was based more on pastoralism, agricultural expansion, and regional kingdoms. Still, there are many who feel that the mystery of this gap remains unsolved, and we are left with many unanswered questions. Could there have been a hidden force, perhaps a migration of peoples or the rise of a new power, that remains undocumented by the surviving evidence? Did the shift in the subcontinent's culture and technology occur more gradually than we imagine, or was it the result of external influences, such as invasion or climate change? The late Harappan Early Iron Age transition remains one of South Asia's greatest unsolved mysteries. The cities of the Indus Valley are gone, and the civilization that built them has left behind only fragments of its once great achievements. The centuries that followed remain suspended in time, quiet, elusive, and difficult to understand. What truly happened to the people of the Harappan cities, and how much of their legacy might still be hidden, waiting to be uncovered beneath the surface of this vast, ancient land? As we shift our focus from the silent gap of South Asia's late Harappan to early Iron Age transition, we now turn toward a region that sits at the crossroads of East and West, a land once brimming with the echoes of empires and cultures. In the arid plains and rugged mountains of Central Asia, particularly in what we now know as Bactria, modern-day Afghanistan and parts of surrounding Central Asia, a great mystery lingers, a silence that follows the collapse of the Greco-Bactrian kingdom. This gap, which stretches from the 2nd century BC to the dawn of the Sassanid Empire in the 3rd century AD, remains one of the most perplexing and largely unexplained periods in the history of the ancient world. The Greco-Bactrian kingdom, established after the conquests of Alexander the Great, was an extraordinary fusion of Greek and local Central Asian cultures. For a time, the city of Bactra, modern-day Balkh, stood as a thriving metropolis where Greek philosophers, soldiers, and traders mingled with local Bactrians and other peoples of the steppe and the Indian subcontinent. The Hellenistic influence was strong. Greek coins were minted, Greek art flourished, and the city itself became a melting pot of ideas, philosophies, and cultures. Yet by the mid-2nd century BC, this prosperous kingdom began to fracture. The Greco-Bactrian kingdom fell apart under a series of external pressures, chiefly invasions by the Yuezhi and other nomadic steppe tribes. These nomads, fleeing from the expanding Xiongnu Empire to the east, swept through Bactria, eventually leading to the kingdom's collapse. In the wake of this invasion, the region experienced a strange and unsettling silence. The vibrant Greco-Bactrian culture vanished, but in its place, a historical void opened, a gap so profound that it has left scholars wondering what happened in the centuries that followed. The region didn't remain completely empty. It continued to be populated by various peoples and kingdoms, including the Kushan Empire, which emerged in the 1st century AD. Yet the transition between the fall of the Greco-Bactrian kingdom and the rise of the Kushans is marked by a scarcity of surviving historical records. Archaeological evidence from this period is sparse, and the written sources are minimal. How could such a rich and vibrant region, once teeming with the influence of the Hellenistic world, fall into obscurity so quickly? One theory posits that the nomadic invasions, including those by the Yuezhi, completely disrupted the once thriving cultural and economic networks of Bactria. The steppe tribes, which were known for their mobile, decentralized way of life, may not have placed a high value on written records or monumental architecture. The harsh nomadic lifestyle, coupled with their frequent migrations, might have erased much of the legacy of the Greco-Bactrian kingdom. This could explain why the historical record from this time is so fragmentary. But while this explanation accounts for the absence of major urban centers or Greek-influenced artifacts in some areas, it does little to explain the almost total disappearance of the Hellenistic imprint on the region. Another theory suggests that the Kushan Empire, which rose from the ashes of the Greco-Bactrian kingdom, actively sought to suppress the memory of their Greek predecessors. The Kushans, led by the Kushan Dynasty, were themselves a diverse group, a mix of Yuezhi nomads, Indian, Persian, and Central Asian peoples. To solidify their own rule and identity, they may have sought to distance themselves from the Greek legacy, erasing or transforming cultural symbols and records from the earlier period. If this was indeed the case, it would explain why the records of the Greco-Bactrian kingdom fade so completely, and why the Kushan Empire, while inheriting the region, left little to no trace of the Greek world. However, the lack of Greek influence in the Kushan period doesn't necessarily mean it was wiped away. Coinage is one of the key pieces of evidence from this period, and the shift from Greek-style coins to Kushan-style coinage could mark the transformation of the region's identity. Yet, despite this transition in art and symbol, some scholars argue that the Greeks never truly disappeared. They were simply assimilated into a new culture. Greek soldiers, traders, and philosophers may have remained in the region, blending their heritage with the emerging Kushan culture. But if this is the case, why is there such a lack of written records or other traces of this cultural fusion? One of the more speculative theories involves the idea that the region experienced a disruptive event that led to a form of cultural amnesia. Could there have been a sudden natural disaster, an earthquake, flood, or even a climate change event that destroyed the cities and records of the Greco-Bactrian kingdom? The region sits at the crossroads of tectonic plates and has a history of seismic activity. Such a disaster could have wiped out not just the infrastructure of the cities, but also the cultural memory of the people, leaving a blank canvas for the next civilization to emerge. And then, there is the possibility that cultural integration in the wake of the Greco-Bactrian collapse simply led to the erasure of the old order. The Kushan Empire, with its blend of cultures, may have adopted and adapted elements of Hellenistic thought, art, and governance, without leaving behind explicit records. The Kushan coins, for instance, feature Greek-style portraits, but these may have been symbolic rather than reflective of a genuine effort to maintain Greek traditions. Over time, these symbols may have been transformed into something more appropriate for the emerging Kushan identity, which blended Greek, Persian, Indian, and nomadic influences. But none of these theories entirely accounts for the profound silence that followed the collapse of the Greco-Bactrian kingdom. Where did the people of the Greco-Bactrian cities go? Did they simply disappear into the wider currents of history, absorbed into the Kushan Empire, or was there something more mysterious at play? Was there a mass migration, a hidden shift in population, or even a deliberate erasure of the past that caused the historical record to go silent? As we look at the ruins of Bactria, the faded coins, the remnants of Hellenistic architecture, and the sparse records left behind, one question remains. How much of the story of Hellenistic Central Asia has yet to be discovered? What remains hidden beneath the sands of time, waiting to reveal the true nature of this silent gap in history? The answers may lie just out of reach, lost to the winds of time, or perhaps they are yet to be uncovered in the untold layers of the land itself. As we move from the mystery of Greco-Bactrian Central Asia to another perplexing gap in history, we now journey to the heart of the Roman Empire, Gaul. The vast, once thriving lands of modern-day France and parts of Belgium, Luxembourg, and Western Germany were among the richest and most heavily populated regions of the Roman world. Yet, in the 3rd century AD, something strange began to unfold, an event that would leave its mark on the history of Roman Gaul for centuries to come. In the Roman era, Gaul was a region of great economic importance. The fertile lands provided grain, wine, and other staples that fed not just Gaul itself, but much of the empire. The cities, like Lugdunum, modern Lyon, Arelite, Arles, and Massalia, Marseille, were bustling hubs of commerce and culture. Villas and estates dotted the countryside, tended to by local farmers who cultivated everything from olives to vegetables, while towns and villages thrived under the rule of the Roman state. However, during the 3rd century AD, something unusual began to happen. A marked decline in rural population started to take place, a depopulation that affected the heart of Gaul itself. This decline is not merely a reflection of economic collapse or migration. It's a stark, unexplained phenomenon that continues to haunt historians and archaeologists. In the archaeological record, this depopulation gap is clear. Large swaths of rural Gaul, once dense with settlements, show signs of abandonment. Excavations reveal empty farmsteads, abandoned villas, and deserted villages, sometimes with little to no trace of the families or workers who had lived there. Sites that had once been vibrant hubs of agricultural production appear to have been suddenly deserted, with no clear explanation for the exodus. But this isn't just an ordinary phenomenon of decay or decline. The depopulation is striking in its speed and its scope, suggesting that something catastrophic or extraordinary was taking place. The question arises: what caused the sudden rural depopulation of Gaul in the 3rd century? The mainstream explanations for the depopulation gap typically focus on a combination of economic decline, external invasions, and internal instability. In the 3rd century, the Roman Empire was facing serious challenges. The so-called crisis of the 3rd century saw the empire fractured by civil war, economic turmoil, and pressure from external enemies such as the Goths, Franks, and Alemanni. Raids and invasions from these barbarian groups were frequent and devastating. The Gallo-Roman countryside, particularly in the northern and eastern regions, was increasingly vulnerable to these attacks, with villages and rural estates being plundered and burned. The decline in agricultural productivity caused by these raids may have driven people away from the countryside, seeking the relative safety of the larger cities, or fleeing to areas that were less exposed to external threats. Yet, while external violence could explain part of the problem, it doesn't fully account for the depth of the rural depopulation that took place. After all, cities like Lugdunum and Arelate continued to thrive during this period, even as the countryside around them seemed to empty out. Why would the rural areas, which had been integral to the Roman economy, suffer such a drastic decline while the cities remained populated? Another theory links this depopulation to the economic collapse within the empire. By the 3rd century, the Roman economy was struggling under the weight of hyperinflation, a devaluation of currency, and a weakening of trade networks. The countryside, which depended heavily on local agriculture and trade, would have been especially vulnerable to these economic shifts. As the Roman elite became more focused on securing the empire's core provinces, the peripheries, including rural Gaul, began to see less investment and attention from the central government. With this loss of state support, it's possible that many rural communities faced economic ruin and were left to fend for themselves. Without resources or infrastructure, many of the countryside's inhabitants may have simply migrated elsewhere. Yet there are aspects of this mystery that remain unexplained. Why did the depopulation occur so suddenly? If it were simply the result of economic collapse or external invasions, one might expect a more gradual decline. But instead, the archaeological record shows an almost precipitous fall in rural populations, with certain areas appearing to have been abandoned almost overnight. The rapidity of this shift suggests that there may have been something else at play, a factor or event that caused people to flee in great numbers in a very short span of time. Some historians have suggested that the spread of disease might have been a contributing factor to the depopulation. The plague, which ravaged the Roman Empire multiple times throughout the 2nd and 3rd centuries, could have had a particularly devastating effect on rural populations, who may not have had the resources to fight off a widespread epidemic. The plague of Cyprian, which hit the empire between 249 and 262 AD, may have contributed to the sharp drop in rural populations. However, the evidence for a direct link between the plague and the depopulation of Gaul's countryside is largely circumstantial. While diseases like the plague could certainly have had a significant impact, they don't explain why rural Gaul would have experienced such a mass exodus at a specific point in time. There are even more speculative theories that suggest the depopulation might have been tied to a mass migration, not due to invasion, but perhaps driven by a collective shift in lifestyle or belief. Did the inhabitants of rural Gaul abandon their lands as part of a larger cultural or religious movement? Some suggest that the rise of Christianity during this period, with its promise of salvation and community, may have contributed to a reorientation of social priorities, leading people to abandon their farms in search of a new spiritual existence in the cities. Though this theory is more difficult to substantiate, the fact that Christianity was spreading rapidly across the empire in the 3rd century, particularly among urban populations, cannot be entirely ruled out. Finally, some have suggested that the rural depopulation could have been a consequence of internal power struggles within the Roman Empire, such as local aristocracies or military commanders consolidating power. Could it be that local rulers or elites in Gaul enforced harsh policies that led to forced migrations, or that they drained the rural economy to support the empire's military campaigns? The barracks emperors of the 3rd century, who were often military leaders with little regard for the civilian population, may have been indirectly responsible for the depopulation by focusing their resources on maintaining military power rather than supporting agricultural or civilian life. The Roman Gaul rural depopulation gap remains an open mystery, with no single explanation able to fully account for the scale or suddenness of the phenomenon. What drove the people of Gaul's countryside to abandon their homes? Was it economic collapse, external threats, disease, or something more profound? Or was it a combination of factors, unseen forces working in tandem, that caused a once thriving rural landscape to fall into silence? The answers may lie buried in the layers of time, hidden in the quiet fields and forgotten ruins of Gaul, waiting to be discovered. As we move from the Roman Gaul depopulation to the next enigmatic gap in history, we now turn our focus to the Balkans, a region whose history is defined by a series of invasions, migrations, and cultural transformations. It was here, in the rugged landscapes and dense forests of southeastern Europe, that a strange demographic mystery unfolded, a gap that continues to baffle historians and archaeologists to this day. The Balkans, a crossroads of cultures and empires, were at the heart of early medieval Europe. After the fall of the Roman Empire, the region became a patchwork of rival states, barbarian kingdoms, and shifting power dynamics. By the 6th century AD, the area was under the control of the Byzantine Empire, yet it also became a battleground for various Slavic migrations, Avar invasions, and the remnants of Roman authority. Cities like Serdica, modern Sofia, and Dyrrhachium, modern Durrës, were vital centers of commerce, culture, and administration, while the countryside remained sparsely populated or inhabited by increasingly isolated rural communities. Yet, for all the movement and conflict, a demographic gap emerged in the early medieval Balkans, one that remains inexplicable to this day. The population of the region, as recorded by later Byzantine historians and scholars, seems to have sharply declined at certain points during this period. Archaeological evidence indicates that, by the early 7th century, many formerly inhabited areas were suddenly abandoned. Settlements that had once thrived seemed to disappear almost overnight. These abrupt shifts are not easily explained by invasion or disease, leaving an unsettling silence in the historical record. One of the most striking examples of this demographic shift can be found in the northern Balkans, particularly in the territories that would later become Serbia, Bulgaria, and parts of modern Romania. Here, archaeological excavations have uncovered abandoned villages, fortified settlements, and cities in ruins, all of which seem to have been suddenly deserted in the early 7th century AD. The Slavic migration into the Balkans is often cited as the primary cause of this shift. According to the historical narrative, Slavic tribes moved into the region in large numbers during the 6th and 7th centuries, displacing or assimilating the existing populations. But this explanation, while plausible, raises several important questions. If the Slavs were merely replacing one population with another, why do we see such a sudden and dramatic depopulation? Where did the people go, and why did these settlements fall so quickly? The mainstream explanation for the demographic gap centers on the Slavic invasions, which were part of a broader movement of barbarian tribes across Europe following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. According to historians, the Slavs moved into the Balkans, filling the power vacuum left by the Roman and Byzantine withdrawal. The Slavs, often seen as a nomadic people, were in the process of settling into the region and establishing their own territories. The cities and villages that had once been under Roman or Byzantine control were, in many cases, abandoned and then repopulated by Slavic groups who brought their own customs, language, and social structures. Yet, the narrative of Slavic migration does not fully explain the profound demographic collapse that seems to have taken place. If the Slavs were simply replacing the local population, one would expect a continuity of settlement, perhaps with some cultural shifts, but with ongoing habitation of the land. Instead, archaeological evidence suggests something more dramatic: empty spaces, deserted cities, and abandoned fortifications. What caused the sudden disappearance of these urban centers, and where did the inhabitants go? The silence in the historical record surrounding this event only deepens the mystery. There are a number of speculative theories that seek to answer this question. One possible explanation involves disease, perhaps an outbreak of the plague, which could have ravaged the region and caused large-scale depopulation. The plague of Justinian, which swept through the Byzantine Empire in the mid-6th century, decimated large portions of the population in the eastern Mediterranean and beyond. However, while the plague likely contributed to the decline of urban populations, it seems unlikely to have caused the sudden abandonment of entire regions, particularly when there is no definitive evidence of widespread plague-related deaths in the Balkans during this period. Another theory suggests that the Avar invasions may have played a more significant role in the depopulation of the Balkans. The Avars, a nomadic group of Turkic origin, invaded the Balkans in the 6th century and established their own empire in the region. They were notorious for their raids, which often targeted urban centers and fortifications. Could the Avars have driven out local populations, causing them to flee to other regions? The Avars were not merely raiders. They were conquerors who established their own rule over large swaths of the Balkans, and their presence could have triggered a mass migration or displacement of the indigenous population. Yet, even this theory does not fully account for the suddenness of the depopulation, or why it was so extensive. Some historians have suggested that the gap in population was the result of internal conflict within the Byzantine Empire, or even political upheaval within the region. The 7th century was a time of great instability in the empire, with civil wars, power struggles, and external threats. It's possible that the rural population, particularly in the north, was forced to abandon their homes due to shifting borders, military pressure, or changes in governance. Yet, while this may explain localized depopulation, it still fails to provide a satisfying answer for the sudden and widespread demographic collapse that left entire cities abandoned and entire regions sparsely populated. One of the more speculative theories posits that the region may have experienced a form of cultural erasure, where the existing population was absorbed into other emerging cultures in the Balkans. Could it be that the region's inhabitants were integrated into new, evolving societal structures, such as those established by the Slavs, Byzantines, or Avars, but without leaving behind distinct traces? This theory is difficult to prove, yet it raises interesting questions about the way civilizations absorb and transform one another. Despite these theories, the early medieval Balkans demographic gap remains a profound mystery. The reasons for the abandonment of settlements, the decline of rural populations, and the disappearance of urban centers are still not fully understood. Were these shifts due to invasions, disease, migration, or a combination of forces? Or is there another explanation yet to be uncovered? The answers may still lie hidden in the layers of time, waiting to be found in the ruins of these long-forgotten cities. What really happened to the people who once inhabited this region? And what secrets might still be waiting to be uncovered beneath the surface of the Balkan earth? As we transition from the mysterious demographic shifts of the early medieval Balkans, we now turn to an even more elusive gap in the annals of history, one that stretches across the waters to Britain. This is the story of the Saxon migration, a period of profound change that reshaped the entire island, yet remains strangely obscured in historical records. Here, amid the windswept coasts and rolling hills of ancient Britain, a blank space in the timeline persists, one that has left historians puzzled for centuries. The 5th century AD marks the beginning of a period in British history where everything seems to grow quieter. After the Roman Empire withdrew its legions from Britain around 410 AD, leaving the island to fend for itself, a new chapter was written, or rather, not written. Archaeological evidence shows that, in the centuries that followed, the Saxons, along with other Germanic tribes like the Angles and the Jutes, began to migrate across the sea and settle in Britain. By the time the Saxon kingdoms emerged in the 6th century, what had occurred in the centuries before was shrouded in mystery. The mainstream historical narrative suggests that the Saxons arrived in Britain in a series of waves, filling the void left by the Romans. The 5th and 6th centuries are often framed as a time of post-Roman collapse in Britain, where the native Britons were under increasing pressure from the influx of Saxons. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which would later be written in the 9th century, provides some insight into this period, but much of its content is either mythologized or retrospective, written long after the events it describes. When it comes to the actual migration and the exact process of the Saxon settlement, the historical sources are strikingly thin. What's remarkable is the absence of documentation from the 5th century, a time when the migration was reportedly taking place. There are no detailed records of the Saxons crossing from northern Europe to Britain, no eyewitness accounts of the struggles or negotiations involved in their settlement. Roman sources, which were abundant before their withdrawal from Britain, go eerily quiet during this period. Instead, the historical void is filled only with vague references and later interpretations. Why is there so little written record from such a transformative period? The lack of historical documentation has given rise to many theories. One explanation is that the Britons themselves, after the Roman legions left, were in a state of chaos and disarray. With the collapse of Roman rule, Britain was left fragmented, and it's possible that the surviving Britons simply had no capacity to document events in any systematic way. The Saxon invasions, while surely a massive cultural shift, might not have been viewed as significant enough to warrant recording, at least in the early stages, as the fragmented nature of post-Roman Britain left little to record it with. Another theory suggests that the Saxons themselves, as seafaring raiders and later settlers, were not an organized or centralized people at first. Without a unified state or kingdom, a hallmark of Roman and later Anglo-Saxon society, they might not have had any formal structures in place for documentation. The nature of their migration, being a dispersed, loosely connected group of tribes, could explain the lack of coordinated record-keeping. However, this theory raises a pressing question. If the Saxons did not keep records, why are there so few contemporary Roman accounts of the migration, especially considering the Romanized Britons would have had much to lose from the Saxon settlements? While some Roman historians and writers mention the collapse of Roman rule in Britain, and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle offers vague allusions to the Saxons' arrival, there is remarkably little information about the events as they unfolded. Was the migration really so chaotic and decentralized that no one saw fit to document it? The historical gap deepens when we consider the archaeological record. While there is clear evidence of Saxon settlements throughout Britain, including cemeteries, burials, and weaponry, these sites often appear without any accompanying written explanation. The material culture of the Saxons, tools, pottery, jewelry, suggests a gradual integration of Saxons into the landscape, but the timeline of this integration is unclear. Was this process a rapid invasion, as some early historians have suggested? Or was it a slower migration and settling process, as others argue? Some archaeologists have pointed to the existence of fortified towns or Roman villas that appear to have been abandoned or transformed during the 5th and 6th centuries. These sites, particularly along the southern coast of Britain, could suggest the Saxons were not solely invaders, but were engaging in a longer, more complex process of settlement and interactions with the native Britons. But still, why is there such an absence of written sources from the time? One of the more speculative theories is that the Saxon migration might have been less violent than it is often portrayed. Perhaps, rather than a series of brutal invasions, the Saxons slowly integrated into the existing power structures of Britain, filling the power vacuum left by the Romans. This theory suggests that the Saxon settlers were not invaders, but allies or even mercenaries who gradually became an essential part of the local power networks. The lack of documentation could be the result of this smooth integration, where Saxon arrivals were viewed as a natural continuation of British society, albeit with shifting cultural dynamics. Another possible, more fringe theory posits that there may have been a concerted effort to suppress or erase records of the Saxon migration. Was there a deliberate attempt by later ruling powers, perhaps the Normans or the early Anglo-Saxon kings themselves, to rewrite the history of their ancestors in a way that erased the migration's true nature? If Saxon warriors initially came as invaders or even raiders, could their descendants have sought to portray their origins as noble and unchallenged, leading to the deliberate omission of the details of their arrival? Whatever the explanation, the absence of clear documentation surrounding the Saxon migration remains one of the great gaps in early British history. What really happened during this transformative period? Was the migration a rapid, violent invasion, or a more gradual, peaceful integration? Why did the records go silent just when the Saxons were supposed to be shaping the island's future? And perhaps most intriguingly, what might be hiding beneath the historical silence? Lost records, forgotten accounts, or even hidden truths about how Britain was truly transformed? The answers remain elusive, leaving us to wonder, how much more of this story remains lost to time? As we leave behind the Saxon migration in Britain and turn our attention southward, we arrive at the sun-baked Iberian Peninsula, a land with a history as rich and complex as any in Europe. Here, the shadow of one of the most enigmatic gaps in history lingers: the Visigothic period, a time of transition from Roman rule to the dominance of the Visigoths, and a moment in Iberian history that seems to fade into almost complete silence. In the wake of the Roman Empire's collapse, the Visigoths entered the Iberian Peninsula in the early 5th century AD, carving out their own kingdom. The Visigoths, originally a Germanic tribe from the steppes of Eastern Europe, had already become a dominant force in the Roman Empire's decline after their sack of Rome in 410 AD. They were no mere raiders. The Visigoths were among the first of many tribes to settle in the western territories of the former Roman Empire. By the early 6th century, the Visigothic kingdom was established in Iberia, with its capital in Toledo, a city that would become one of the most important cultural and religious centers in medieval Spain. However, the history of the Visigothic period in Iberia is marked by a significant record collapse. The kingdom's reign, which lasted until the early 8th century, seems to vanish from the historical record in startlingly abrupt fashion. Documents from this era are scarce, and what we do have, particularly from the time between the 6th and 7th centuries, appears fragmented, inconsistent, or lost entirely. It is as if an entire chapter of Iberian history has been erased. Let's begin by examining the historical context of the Visigothic reign. When the Visigoths arrived in Iberia, they settled in a land already home to the remnants of Roman rule, as well as various other Germanic tribes. The Visigoths initially controlled parts of the southern regions of the peninsula, and over time expanded their reach, absorbing much of the Iberian territory. The Visigothic kings, such as King Alaric II and Leovigild, sought to consolidate their power, establishing a kingdom that was both Romanized and distinctly Germanic. The Visigoths were deeply involved in the politics of the former Roman Empire, forging alliances and engaging in internal struggles to strengthen their hold over Iberia. Under their rule, Toledo became a significant center for both Christianity and Roman law. Yet for all their influence, the Visigothic rulers seemed strangely unwilling or unable to preserve a coherent record of their time. When we look at the surviving evidence, we find very little written documentation from the Visigothic period. Historical texts are sparse, and much of what we know about their kingdom comes from later sources, often written centuries after the events they describe. Isidore of Seville, writing in the 7th century, offers a glimpse into Visigothic life, but his accounts are not contemporary and were written in a different context. What happened to the records that would have been kept by the Visigoths themselves? The Roman legacy in the West was famous for its meticulous record-keeping, its public inscriptions, legal codes, and historical writings. Yet in contrast, the Visigoths, despite their Roman influence, left behind only a handful of laws. The Liber Judiciorum, a legal code from the 7th century, being one of the few surviving documents from their reign. This sparse collection of legal and historical material is in stark contrast to the detailed annals of the Byzantine Empire or the Franks in Gaul, suggesting a distinct absence of interest in recording their own history. Why would the Visigoths, who ruled much of Iberia for centuries, fail to leave behind a more comprehensive written record? There are several explanations that scholars have put forward, but none fully resolve the mystery. One common theory is that the Visigothic elite, though Romanized, maintained a deep cultural attachment to their oral traditions. Many Germanic tribes, including the Goths, did not place the same value on written records as the Romans did. Their oral history, passed down through epic tales and songs, may have been sufficient for their needs. This reliance on oral tradition, rather than written documentation, could explain why there was little inclination to produce historical records, especially during the early centuries of Visigothic rule. But this theory does not fully explain the absence of records in the centuries that followed, particularly during the 6th and 7th centuries, when the Visigothic kingdom had firmly established itself in Iberia. As the Visigothic rulers became more intertwined with Romanized traditions, one would expect that they would begin to adopt and maintain some of the record-keeping practices of their predecessors. After all, the Roman Empire had kept detailed records, and the Visigoths were in many ways heirs to that tradition. Could it be that Roman records simply didn't survive the transition from Roman to Visigothic rule? Did the collapse of Roman infrastructure and society leave a vacuum in which written records were not maintained? Another theory is that the Visigothic kingdom was faced with internal instability that led to the loss of records. The period of Visigothic rule in Iberia was marked by infighting, with kings often facing challenges from rival factions, including other Visigothic noble families. The Council of Toledo, which was central to Visigothic political and religious life, could not always keep order in the face of internal conflict. The Visigoths, despite their initial successes, struggled to maintain a stable and unified state. This may have led to a destruction of records during times of upheaval, as rival factions may have sought to erase the history or authority of their opponents. Yet, perhaps the most intriguing theory is that of a deliberate suppression of history. Could it be that the Visigothic ruling class chose to deliberately limit their documentation in order to create a specific narrative of their rule? We know that the Visigoths, particularly under King Recared I, converted to Catholicism in the late 6th century, abandoning their earlier Arian Christianity. This shift in religious affiliation was significant, as it allowed the Visigoths to integrate more fully with the Catholic majority in Iberia. It's possible that the conversion led to a rewrite of their history, a move to align their past with the orthodoxy of the Roman Catholic Church. In this context, could earlier records, particularly those associated with the Arian faith, have been intentionally suppressed to create a new, more acceptable narrative? Whatever the explanation, the Visigothic record collapse remains one of the great mysteries of early medieval Iberia. How could a kingdom that spanned much of the Iberian Peninsula, influencing the course of European history for centuries, leave so little behind? What happened to the historical records of the Visigoths, and why did they disappear so quickly from the historical stage? The answers to these questions may lie hidden beneath the sands of time, waiting to be uncovered. For now, the mystery of Visigothic Iberia remains, leaving us to wonder what knowledge, stories, and truths may still be lost in the pages of history. As we leave behind the vanished records of the Visigothic Iberian period, our journey now takes us to the harsh yet alluring Arabian Peninsula, a region that has long been shrouded in both historical obscurity and cultural intrigue. The pre-Islamic era of Arabia remains one of the most fascinating and enigmatic periods in the ancient world. Amidst its deserts and oases, there exists a historical gap that continues to defy explanation, a mystery of urban development that seems to vanish into the arid sands. For centuries, Arabia was regarded by many as a largely nomadic and tribal society. To the outside world, it appeared as little more than a vast desert wilderness, inhabited by Bedouins and scattered villages. However, this perception, while partially true, belies a much more complex history of early urbanism, trade, and civilization that seems to have been lost to time. It is in the pre-Islamic period, prior to the rise of Islam in the 7th century, that we encounter a sudden, unexplained gap in the historical record, particularly with regard to urban life. The question we must ask is, how did a region that would later give birth to one of the world's most powerful empires appear to have so few traces of urban settlements or large-scale cities before Islam? Let's begin by setting the scene. Southwestern Arabia, in particular the area that is now Yemen, once held the kingdom of Saba, or Sheba, a powerful and wealthy kingdom that thrived for centuries before the arrival of Islam. Ancient texts, including the Bible and the Quran, mention the kingdom of Saba, suggesting a civilization with significant cultural, political, and economic influence. Yet, when we examine the physical remnants of this kingdom, something striking appears. While there are remarkable architectural feats, such as the ancient Marib Dam and temples, many of the urban centers from this time appear to have disappeared without leaving a coherent historical record. Despite the kingdom of Saba's apparent prosperity, historical accounts are sparse, and the archaeological record remains fragmented. The questions surrounding the decline of Saba and the broader collapse of other ancient Arabian kingdoms continue to confound historians. What caused such seemingly sudden shifts in the urban landscape? Why did a once thriving region of urban civilization not leave behind a clearer historical trace? To understand this, we need to look closer at the cities that did exist in the pre-Islamic Arabian world, particularly in the western and southern regions of the peninsula. In the 5th and 6th centuries AD, places like Najran, Qataban, and Hadramaut stood as active centers of commerce and political power. These cities were strategically positioned along the ancient incense trade routes, which connected the Arabian Peninsula with the Mediterranean world and Africa. Archaeological evidence from these areas suggests bustling trade and sophisticated urban life, carved stone inscriptions, granaries, and temples, all pointing to a developed society. But when we look at the long timeline of pre-Islamic Arabia, we find that urban development seems to stop abruptly. After the 6th century, a noticeable decline in these urban centers becomes apparent. The once thriving cities in the south, particularly around the modern-day Yemeni highlands, began to crumble and be abandoned. Saba, which had enjoyed relative prominence, eventually saw its power erode, and the famous dam at Marib, which had once irrigated vast stretches of desert, eventually collapsed, both literally and metaphorically, around the early 7th century AD. The precise cause of this decline remains uncertain. Some historians believe that the shift in trade routes, combined with the arrival of new external pressures like Ethiopian invasions or even Persian incursions, contributed to the collapse. Others suggest that environmental factors, such as drought or the gradual desiccation of the once fertile lands of the Arabian heartland, may have played a role. While these explanations are plausible, they fail to fully account for the suddenness and extent of the urban collapse, leaving us with more questions than answers. One of the most compelling aspects of this historical gap is the lack of continuity between these early Arabian urban centers and the later rise of Islam. When Prophet Muhammad began his revelations in the early 7th century, the region was home to a variety of tribal communities and cities, but many of the previous urban centers had already decayed or vanished altogether. Mecca and Medina, which would later become the twin capitals of Islam, were not major urban centers by the standards of their time. They were small cities or towns, far less developed than the urbanized hubs of places like Rome or Ctesiphon in the neighboring Persian Empire. What then happened to the earlier cities of Arabia, and why do they seem to vanish so abruptly? One possible explanation is that the social and economic structure of Arabia underwent a profound transformation. Prior to the rise of Islam, Arabian society was highly tribal, and the concept of settled urbanism may not have been central to the worldview of the region's dominant peoples. In such a context, urban centers might have been temporary or unstable, with cities rising and falling in response to shifts in power, trade, and environment. But this theory raises another question. Why would a thriving urban culture collapse so suddenly, without leaving lasting traces? There is also the religious dimension to consider. Prior to the rise of Islam, Arabia was home to a number of pagan and polytheistic societies, which had their own religious practices centered around tribal shrines and sanctuaries. The most famous of these was Kaaba in Mecca, which was an important religious site long before it became central to Islam. Some scholars suggest that the rise of Islam, with its strong monotheistic and unifying ideology, might have helped consolidate power in new ways, leaving the old urban structures to fade away as society reorganized itself around new religious, political, and social systems. There are also more speculative theories to consider. One that has gained attention in recent years suggests that the urban centers in southern Arabia might have been influenced by earlier civilizations, possibly even those of ancient Mesopotamia or the Indus Valley. Yet these links remain tenuous. Could there have been external forces at play, unknown migrations or interactions with now forgotten cultures, that caused these early urban societies to collapse? And, if so, why do so few records remain to explain such profound changes? Ultimately, the pre-Islamic Arabian urban gap leaves us with more questions than answers. Was the decline of these cities a natural process driven by climate change, political upheaval, or economic shifts? Or was it something more mysterious, perhaps a result of forces that we have yet to understand? And why, after such vibrant and ancient civilizations, does so little evidence remain to illuminate their histories? As we look toward the future, perhaps the answers to these mysteries lie hidden beneath the shifting sands of Arabia, waiting to be uncovered by future archaeologists, historians, and explorers. The urban gap in pre-Islamic Arabia remains one of the most intriguing and unresolved mysteries in the history of the ancient world, and its secrets may still be waiting to emerge. What other truths lie buried in the forgotten cities of ancient Arabia? Only time, and perhaps the next great discovery, will tell. As we move further across the globe, we find ourselves in the Horn of Africa, a region that was once home to one of the most prosperous and mysterious civilizations of the ancient world, the Axumite Empire. The Kingdom of Axum, as it is often called, thrived from roughly the 1st century AD to the 8th century AD, controlling much of modern-day Ethiopia and Eritrea, and wielding influence over a vast swath of territory extending into the Red Sea, parts of the Arabian Peninsula, and beyond. The Axumites were masters of trade, their empire at the crossroads of some of the world's most important commercial routes. Yet, as swiftly as it rose, the empire and its once thriving trade network seemed to have disappeared, leaving behind only echoes in the sand. Imagine standing at the edge of the modern city of Axum, an ancient site dotted with towering obelisks and broken ruins, where the once great kingdom of Axum ruled with considerable power. The remnants of their stone obelisks rise sharply against the Ethiopian sky, monuments that once marked the tombs of their kings, including the famous King Ezana, who converted the kingdom to Christianity in the 4th century, a pivotal moment in African history. This conversion marked the Axumite Empire as one of the earliest Christian kingdoms, an achievement that solidified their place in history. The city, once the heart of the empire, is still an archaeological treasure trove, with inscriptions, ruins, and ancient coinage scattered across the land. Yet, when we try to piece together the complete history of the Axumite Empire, we hit a wall, an unsettling silence. The empire, which controlled one of the most important trade networks in the ancient world, suddenly seems to vanish from the historical record by the 8th century, leaving little more than ruins and vague references in the accounts of later civilizations. The Axumite trade network was extraordinary. At its peak, it connected the Mediterranean world to the Indian Ocean, serving as a conduit between the Roman Empire, Palestine, India, and even China. The empire's ports along the Red Sea, such as Adulis, became major trade hubs, facilitating the exchange of goods like ivory, gold, spices, and precious stones. They were also known for their agriculture, producing grain and fruits that could sustain a thriving population. The Axumites traded not only goods, but also cultural influences, spreading Christianity and receiving influences from both Roman and Byzantine culture. But then something happened. Around the 8th century, the once vibrant Axumite trade routes began to falter, and Adulis, the bustling port city, seemed to have lost its importance. The kingdom's influence waned, and the Axumite Empire gradually fragmented. So what happened to the once mighty network of trade and culture? The mainstream explanation posits that the decline was due to Islamic expansion in the 7th century, which altered trade routes and power dynamics in the region. As Islamic traders began to dominate the Red Sea and Arabian Gulf, the Axumites were increasingly cut off from their traditional trading partners. In the face of this new power shift, Axum's cities and ports slowly declined. However, this explanation doesn't account for all the complexities surrounding the Axumite disappearance. If the fall was purely due to external pressures, why did the empire continue for another century or so in a diminished form? Why was there no dramatic collapse, no final conquest, no massive upheaval, just a gradual fade into obscurity? This gap in our understanding has led some scholars to explore other theories. One possibility is that the climate played a significant role. The Ethiopian highlands, where Axum was located, were once highly fertile, but environmental changes, such as droughts or soil degradation, may have undermined the empire's agricultural base. Without a stable food supply, the Axumite economy would have been severely weakened. This could have triggered a chain of events, causing urban abandonment and a shift in the center of power. But while the environmental theory is compelling, it too remains speculative, as concrete evidence linking climate change to the decline of Axum is scarce. Another theory posits that internal strife, perhaps succession crises or conflicts between the ruling class and religious factions, could have contributed to the empire's decline. The rise of Islam certainly disrupted the regional balance, but the Axumites' Christian identity might have further isolated them from the shifting dynamics of trade. Could there have been a breakdown in internal cohesion that left the empire vulnerable to external forces, not just economically but politically as well? The theory that continues to attract attention, however, is the idea of a sudden, unexplained collapse. Some have suggested that the Axumite civilization might have been struck by an event so significant that it left little trace in the historical record. A catastrophic loss of life, a massive epidemic, or even an unexplained invasion that led to the abandonment of cities and trade routes. If such an event occurred, it could explain why the Axumite Empire faded without the usual signs of a classical collapse. No grand battles, no conquest by a neighboring empire, no sudden overthrow of the monarchy. Rather, the decline was more of a dissipation, a slow erosion of influence that left the once thriving trade centers empty and the once powerful empire seemingly forgotten. Adding to the mystery is the sparse documentation from the time. While we know that the Byzantine Empire and the early Islamic caliphates kept detailed records, there are few mentions of the Axumite decline in their texts. The lack of direct accounts from this period suggests that the empire was not only in a state of decline, but had become increasingly irrelevant to the wider world. Did the empire simply slip through the cracks of history, overlooked by its contemporaries? Or was there an active effort to erase its presence from the historical narrative, perhaps by those who benefited from its decline? There's also the fact that Axumite history has often been filtered through later interpretations. The empire's Christian legacy, which was preserved by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, has made the Axumite period seem more continuous than it may have actually been. In fact, some scholars argue that what we know of the Axumite Empire today has been shaped as much by medieval Ethiopian historians as it has by the historical realities of the time. Could it be that the true nature of the empire's disappearance was obscured by later generations who perhaps didn't wish to confront the imperial collapse or the cultural shifts that followed? As we look across the ruins of Axum and the remnants of its trade network, we are left with a sense of incompleteness. The Axumite Empire, once a powerful kingdom at the crossroads of ancient trade, now seems like a forgotten dream. Its trade routes, which once spanned from Rome to India, have faded into silence, and its legacy, while still evident in the monuments that stand today, remains partially hidden beneath layers of time. What truly caused the Axumite collapse? Was it environmental change, political fragmentation, or something more mysterious? And, perhaps most intriguingly, what might still be buried beneath the sands of the Red Sea or the Ethiopian highlands, waiting to reveal its long-lost secrets? As we continue our exploration of the unexplained gaps in history, the disappearance of the Axumite trade network remains one of the most thought-provoking and unresolved mysteries. What really happened to this once thriving civilization, and what does it tell us about the fragility of empires and the forces that shape the rise and fall of civilizations? Only time, and perhaps the next great discovery, will shed light on these unanswered questions. As we leave behind the ancient trade routes of Axum and move towards the heart of Eastern Europe, we find ourselves in the midst of another mystery, one that stretches back to the very origins of a people whose presence shaped the future of an entire continent, the Slavs. The early origins of the Slavic peoples remain shrouded in a veil of uncertainty, a gap in history that has left scholars perplexed for centuries. Their rise to prominence across Eastern Europe, from the Carpathian Mountains to the Balkans, and their eventual spread across much of Central and Eastern Europe, has long been a subject of intrigue. Yet much of their early history remains elusive. Picture, if you will, the vast plains of what is now Ukraine, Poland, and Russia, where early Slavic tribes are thought to have originated. These regions, covered by dense forests and expansive river systems, would have been fertile ground for settlement. In the 5th and 6th centuries A.D., groups of Slavic tribes began to emerge in the historical record, settling and spreading across a landscape that had long been inhabited by other peoples, such as the Scythians, Goths, and Sarmatians. The Slavs would eventually carve out their own distinctive cultural, linguistic, and political identities. But the question remains: where did they come from, and how did they rise so rapidly? Despite being one of the largest ethnic groups in Europe today, with over 300 million people spread across dozens of nations, the early history of the Slavs remains a complex and fragmented puzzle. Unlike the Romans or the Goths, the Slavs left behind few written records of their own during the critical period of their emergence. The earliest mentions of the Slavs appear in Byzantine and Roman sources, often as vague references to barbarian tribes moving across the steppe. These sources, while valuable, are limited and often fail to provide concrete details about the origins, society, and culture of the Slavs in their formative centuries. The historical gap begins to deepen when we consider that by the 6th century, the Slavs had already begun to emerge as a significant cultural and political force in Eastern Europe, occupying vast territories and establishing communities in areas that would later become Poland, Ukraine, and Russia. Yet, the archaeological record for this period, at least regarding the early formation of Slavic society, remains puzzlingly sparse. While we find evidence of burial mounds, settlements, and pottery, these artifacts alone do not reveal the intricacies of their early social structures, religious beliefs, or the reasons for their rapid expansion. The mainstream explanation for the rise of the Slavs is that they were an Indo-European people who gradually migrated into Eastern Europe from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, an area rich in cultural interaction and trade. The Slavic language itself shares roots with the other Indo-European tongues, but why and how these tribes coalesced into the broader Slavic identity remains unclear. Some historians argue that they were simply a collection of loosely connected tribes that gradually adopted shared linguistic and cultural traits over time, while others suggest that a more organized process of migration and consolidation may have played a role. But these theories are based on piecemeal evidence: linguistic studies, fragmentary written records, and scant archaeological finds that leave more questions than answers. For example, why did the Slavs begin to emerge in such a coordinated manner around the 6th century? It seems as though, almost overnight, the Slavic tribes began to expand into areas that were previously dominated by other groups, such as the Byzantines, Huns, and Avars. It is as if a significant cultural shift or migration took place, yet there is no definitive historical explanation for the early Slavic expansion. Was it a military conquest, a mass migration prompted by external pressures, such as climate change or invasions, or was it a more gradual process of cultural fusion with the neighboring peoples? Adding to this mystery is the curious absence of any centralized political authority or large-scale urbanization among the early Slavs. Unlike the Goths or Romans, who established powerful empires or kingdoms, the early Slavs seem to have lived in small, decentralized tribes with no immediate signs of centralized governance. This lack of political cohesion raises intriguing questions about how such a disparate collection of tribes was able to coalesce into the unified Slavic nations of later centuries. Was there a central figure or a series of events that bound them together? Or was it the result of slow and complex processes that simply took centuries to materialize? Moreover, the archaeological evidence from this period presents a bewildering picture. While later Slavic settlements show evidence of more sophisticated urbanization and state building, the early archaeological record seems to suggest that these tribes lived in temporary settlements with simple structures and basic tools. Yet, in some areas, we also find hints of advanced agricultural practices, as well as intricate burial rituals, suggesting a much deeper social and cultural complexity than previously assumed. How, then, did these seemingly modest beginnings transform into a dominant cultural and political force? Some historians have also proposed that the Slavic migrations were a response to external pressures. Could the Huns or Avars, two of the most powerful nomadic groups of the time, have pushed the Slavs westward and southward? If so, why do we not see more direct evidence of conflict between the Slavs and these invaders? Was the Slavic migration driven by economic opportunities, trade, or even religious shifts, such as the adoption of Christianity? Or could the roots of the Slavs' expansion lie in the remnants of Roman influence, with Romanized tribes adopting Slavic customs and joining the greater migration? And then there are the speculative theories that add layers of intrigue to this mystery. Some have suggested that the Slavic peoples might have been influenced by earlier, ancient civilizations, perhaps the Scythians, the Sarmatians, or even the ancient peoples of the Caucasus. Could there be an older, pre-Slavic culture buried beneath the surface, one that might hold the key to understanding the true origins of the Slavs? Is it possible that an earlier pre-Slavic identity exists in the archaeological record, hidden from view or misinterpreted by previous generations of historians? The gap in our understanding of the early Slavic origins leaves us with a fascinating riddle. How did a group of tribal peoples, scattered across vast regions of Eastern Europe, come together to form one of the most enduring cultural identities in European history? The historical and archaeological evidence, while intriguing, still leaves much to be uncovered. Perhaps there are hidden settlements yet to be discovered, or forgotten records in ancient archives that could shed light on this lost chapter of history. As we ponder the origins of the Slavs, we are reminded of how much of history remains out of reach. What forces shaped the rise of these people, and what role did they play in the broader European migration patterns of the ancient world? The early history of the Slavs remains a story of fragmented pieces, waiting for someone to put them together. What still lies beneath the soil of Eastern Europe, buried in the ruins of long-lost villages and forgotten tombs, that might reveal the answers to this historical mystery? Only time, and perhaps the next great archaeological discovery, will tell. As we continue our exploration of unexplained gaps in history, we now find ourselves in the lush jungles of Cambodia, once home to one of the most powerful and enigmatic civilizations in Southeast Asia, the Khmer Empire. The grandeur of this ancient kingdom is still very much present today, in the towering temples of Angkor Wat and the sprawling ruins of the Angkor Archaeological Park. However, what often gets lost in the vastness of these monumental structures is a much deeper, more unsettling mystery: the Khmer Urban Retreat. An inexplicable shift away from the grand urban centers that had once defined the empire, long before the decline of Angkor Wat. Picture the Angkor Wat temple complex, with its intricate bas-reliefs and towering spires, set against the backdrop of the dense, verdant jungle. The temple, an architectural masterpiece, is often considered the largest religious monument in the world. Its construction, during the 12th century under the reign of King Suryavarman II, marked the height of the Khmer Empire's influence, both politically and culturally. But despite the immense scale of Angkor Wat and its grandeur, there lies a peculiar enigma. The once thriving city of Angkor, the heart of the empire, seems to have experienced a rapid urban retreat long before its eventual collapse in the 15th century. By the 14th century, the grand capital of Angkor had become a shadow of its former self. Angkor, with its vast network of reservoirs, intricate irrigation systems, and monumental temples, had long been the epicenter of the Khmer Empire. The city's urban planning, marked by its vast temples and complex waterworks, was a marvel of ancient engineering designed to support a thriving population. Yet, as the empire began to lose its influence in the region, the once bustling urban core of Angkor seemed to experience a sudden decline. Entire sections of the city were abandoned, and a mysterious urban retreat took place. What happened to cause this mass exodus? And why does this apparent shift in urban patterns remain so poorly understood? The mainstream explanation for this urban retreat points to a combination of climatic factors and overuse of resources. Archaeologists and historians have long suggested that the Khmer Empire's reliance on an intricate system of irrigation designed to water the region's rice paddies eventually contributed to the city's decline. Over time, the water management systems that had once been marvels of engineering began to fail. Periods of drought, combined with the overuse of water resources, led to the erosion of farmlands and the collapse of the water supply systems that had once supported the city's population. As a result, the Khmer capital began to lose its ability to support such a large and growing population, driving people to seek refuge in other regions. However, the question remains: why, if this environmental decline was the cause, did the population leave so suddenly? And more intriguingly, why did they abandon one of the largest urban centers in the world in such a deliberate manner? The Khmer Empire, with its vast network of roads, temples, and palaces, did not simply collapse overnight. The retreat from Angkor seems to have been a gradual but strategic process. Could there have been deeper reasons for this shift? Political, cultural, or religious, beyond just environmental stress? Some historians suggest that the religious changes within the Khmer Empire may have contributed to the retreat. By the 14th century, Hinduism was gradually being overshadowed by Buddhism, which had been introduced to the region through contact with neighboring Southeast Asian kingdoms. As the empire experienced religious shifts, perhaps the grandeur and scale of Angkor Wat, originally constructed as a Hindu temple, became less aligned with the evolving beliefs of the Khmer rulers. Did the shift from Hinduism to Buddhism play a role in the abandonment of the grand temples and urban centers in Angkor? Could this be an example of a cultural disconnection, where the once central hub of power no longer resonated with the changing religious and political landscape? There is also the possibility that the Khmer rulers themselves may have chosen to retreat from Angkor as part of a strategic decision. As the Mongol Empire rose in the east and Southeast Asia became increasingly unstable, the rulers of the Khmer Empire may have moved their capital to more secure and defensible locations. Could this strategic retreat have been driven by fear of foreign invasions, such as from the Thai or Vietnamese, who were gaining power at the time? Evidence of shifting capitals, like the movement from Angkor to Phnom Penh, raises questions about the political motives behind such a mass exodus. If the Khmer Empire was facing political or military pressures, why did the ruling class not leave behind a more detailed record of their decisions? While these theories offer plausible explanations, none of them fully account for the dramatic scale of the Khmer urban retreat. If the abandonment was primarily environmental, why did the population not simply adapt or relocate within the surrounding regions? And if it was a religious or political shift, why were the records of such a transition lost to history? How could such a vast, sophisticated civilization, one that had created one of the world's most impressive urban landscapes, disappear without a clearer explanation. Adding further complexity to the mystery is the fact that Angkor Wat, the grand symbol of Khmer civilization, was not truly abandoned. It remained a site of religious significance even after the urban decline, transitioning into a Buddhist temple complex by the 14th century. This continuity raises more questions. Was the abandonment of the city's urban core and the retreat of the population the result of a loss of faith in their previous religious and political systems? Or was it something more pragmatic? The Khmer Urban Retreat has also sparked more speculative theories, some of which suggest a more catastrophic event at play. Could there have been an unknown natural disaster, such as a massive flood or earthquake, that struck the city and caused a rapid evacuation? Or perhaps there were other, as yet undiscovered, external threats, be they disease, famine, or even an invasion that forced the Khmer to abandon their cities without leaving behind any tangible record of the event. What is certain is that the Khmer retreat does not fit neatly into the conventional historical patterns of imperial collapse. As we stand amidst the towering ruins of Angkor Wat, with its faded stone carvings depicting gods and kings long forgotten, the mystery deepens. The once thriving capital of the Khmer Empire now seems like a ghost city, a reflection of a time when one of the most sophisticated civilizations of its era flourished, and then, inexplicably, retreated into history. What happened to the people who once thrived in this grand city? Were they pushed out by environmental forces, political strife, or a shift in cultural and religious paradigms? And why, after such a magnificent achievement, did the Khmer Empire choose to abandon its cities and retreat into smaller, more isolated centers? The urban retreat of the Khmer remains one of the most puzzling chapters in the history of Southeast Asia, with much still left to uncover beneath the jungle's shadowed canopy. What secrets lie hidden in the remnants of Angkor, waiting to be discovered? And, perhaps more importantly, what might still be lurking in the forgotten corners of the Khmer Empire's decline, waiting for the next generation of historians and archaeologists to unlock its long-buried mysteries? As we move further into the enigmatic silence of history, we find ourselves in the highlands of Andean South America, amidst the mysterious ruins of Tiwanaku, a civilization whose architectural feats and cultural significance have puzzled historians and archaeologists for centuries. The Tiwanaku site, perched near the shores of Lake Titicaca in what is now Bolivia, is one of the most important ancient sites in the Americas, with its colossal stone structures and advanced engineering. Yet, despite its grandeur, there is a conspicuous and unsettling gap in the historical narrative: the post-collapse silence that envelops the civilization after its sudden and unexplained decline. Tiwanaku, once a flourishing urban center, was the heart of an empire that spanned across the Andean highlands, with its influence extending as far as present-day Chile, Argentina, and Peru. The city itself was an impressive testament to the technological prowess of its people. Massive stone platforms, precise astronomical alignments, and intricate sculptures of deities and beings that suggest a culture deeply attuned to both the cosmos and the earth beneath their feet. The Pumapunku complex, with its perfectly cut stones, remains one of the most mysterious features of the site. Its origins, methods of construction, and purpose are still the subject of intense debate. The collapse of Tiwanaku, believed to have occurred around the 8th century AD, marks a mysterious break in the historical record. By the time the Spanish arrived in the Americas centuries later, the once thriving urban center of Tiwanaku was already a shadow of its former self, abandoned and overrun by the encroaching landscape. Yet, the reasons behind its collapse and the subsequent silence surrounding its downfall remain elusive. What exactly led to the disintegration of a civilization that had achieved so much? Mainstream theories suggest that the collapse of Tiwanaku was due to a combination of environmental and economic factors. The most commonly cited explanation is a period of severe climate change, possibly linked to drought or the El Niño phenomenon, which would have disrupted the region's agricultural systems, especially the extensive irrigation networks that sustained the Tiwanaku population. Lake Titicaca, once a vibrant source of water, may have experienced fluctuations in water levels that affected both crop production and the availability of fish, leading to the gradual decline of the city's economy. Yet, this explanation, while plausible, raises more questions than it answers. If climate change was the primary driver of Tiwanaku's downfall, why did the collapse occur so rapidly? And why, despite the environmental challenges, did the civilization not appear to adapt in any way? Unlike other ancient civilizations that faced similar environmental stresses, such as the Maya in the Yucatan or the ancestral Puebloans in the American Southwest, the Tiwanaku people left behind almost no record of their response to the crisis. There are no known written records from Tiwanaku, no tablets, inscriptions, or codices that detail the reasons behind their decline, making it all the more difficult to understand what happened in the final centuries of the civilization's existence. The absence of a written language in Tiwanaku and the lack of first-hand accounts leaves us with only archaeological clues, fragmented pieces of the puzzle that offer tantalizing hints but no definitive answers. The abandoned city itself is a haunting testament to what was once a thriving civilization. Massive stone structures, monolithic statues, and well-planned urban layouts now lie in ruins, as though the people of Tiwanaku simply vanished overnight, leaving their complex society behind without a trace. Where did they go? What happened to the people who once occupied these grand structures? Some scholars speculate that the collapse of Tiwanaku was sudden, perhaps even catastrophic, with a massive environmental shock, such as a sudden flooding or a catastrophic earthquake, leading to the abandonment of the city. The highland region around Lake Titicaca is known to be seismically active, and while the Tiwanaku civilization was advanced in many ways, it may have been ill-equipped to deal with such a natural disaster. However, there is little evidence of such a catastrophe in the archaeological record, and many researchers question whether a natural disaster could explain the complete collapse of a society as complex as Tiwanaku. Another theory suggests that the collapse of Tiwanaku might have been more gradual, driven by a combination of internal political instability and external pressures. The rise of new powers, such as the Incans, who emerged to dominate the Andean region in the centuries after Tiwanaku's decline, might have led to cultural shifts or even conflict. Could the Tiwanaku state have been undermined by internal factions or rival factions as the political structures that supported the civilization broke down? Could it be that tribal or regional conflicts led to a migration of Tiwanaku's population, dispersing them across the Andes and into other emerging states? There is also the possibility that the decline of Tiwanaku was tied to a more spiritual or cultural crisis. The religion and rituals that were central to Tiwanaku's identity may have faltered, and with it, the social cohesion that had held the civilization together. The monumental stone carvings, which depict figures such as the puma, serpent, and other gods, suggest that Tiwanaku's people had a complex spiritual and cosmological worldview. Could the collapse of this worldview have caused a crisis of faith that triggered the retreat from the city? In a society as intertwined with its religious beliefs as Tiwanaku, the disintegration of these beliefs might have led to the disintegration of the civilization itself. But despite all the speculation, the post-collapse silence of Tiwanaku remains one of the most puzzling aspects of its history. After its decline, the region around Lake Titicaca entered a period of relative obscurity, with few signs of significant cultural activity for several centuries. The rise of the Inca Empire in the 15th century marked the first significant resurgence of large-scale civilization in the region. Yet the Incas did not maintain or even reference Tiwanaku in their own historical narratives. This silence suggests that, in the years following its collapse, Tiwanaku's influence may have been forgotten or deliberately erased from the collective memory of the Andean peoples. As we stand at the ruins of Tiwanaku, gazing out at the ancient stone walls and mysterious sculptures that remain, we are left with the haunting question: what really happened to the Tiwanaku people? Were they simply overwhelmed by environmental changes, or did they face a deeper crisis that left them no choice but to retreat into obscurity? What forces, whether natural, political, or spiritual, brought about the downfall of this once great civilization, and why do their voices remain so eerily silent in the historical record? The post-collapse silence of Tiwanaku may never be fully understood, but its mystery persists, a testament to the complexity and fragility of ancient societies. As we continue to unearth the remnants of this civilization, we may yet uncover new clues that bring us closer to the truth. Until then, the question remains: what secrets lie buried beneath the stone ruins of Tiwanaku, waiting to be discovered? As we leave behind the haunting ruins of Tiwanaku, our journey now takes us to another enigma of ancient civilization, nestled high in the Andean highlands of Peru, the once great Wari Empire. Long before the rise of the Inca Empire, the Wari were one of the most powerful and advanced societies in the pre-Columbian Andes, exerting their influence across vast territories and shaping the cultural landscape of the region. However, just like many other great empires, the Wari experienced a sudden and mysterious disappearance, leaving behind an archaeological void that is still the subject of intense speculation and intrigue. The Wari capital, known as Wari, often referred to as Wari, stands as a testament to their once great civilization. Located in the central highlands of Peru, Wari was a city that exemplified the Wari's advanced urban planning, complex irrigation systems, and impressive architectural achievements. The city itself was laid out in an intricate grid pattern with massive stone buildings, ceremonial centers, and expansive plazas. Their engineers developed sophisticated systems of agriculture, utilizing terrace farming and irrigation to support a growing population. The Wari were also known for their artwork, which blended intricate geometric designs with more symbolic representations of the natural world. Yet, despite their advances, the Wari Empire mysteriously collapsed by the end of the 8th century AD, leaving behind a fragmented legacy and a puzzling silence that continues to perplex historians. What led to the disappearance of the Wari administration? Was it a natural disaster, an internal political collapse, or something more elusive, something we still haven't uncovered? The conventional theories often point to a combination of environmental changes and internal instability. The Andean region is notoriously vulnerable to climatic fluctuations, including periods of drought and flooding, which could have strained the Wari's agricultural systems. Evidence suggests that climate change played a role in the empire's eventual downfall, particularly the failure of their once innovative irrigation systems, which were crucial to their ability to feed such a large urban population. Yet, while climatic change and environmental stress certainly played a role in the decline of many ancient civilizations, the Wari's disappearance raises further questions. Why did the Wari Empire, which had dominated the Andean highlands for centuries, collapse so suddenly and without leaving behind a clear record of its decline? Most archaeological findings suggest that by the time the Inca began to rise to power in the 15th century, the Wari administration was nowhere to be found. The vast urban centers they had constructed were abandoned, and their once expansive territories were gradually absorbed by newer powers, including the Tiwanaku and later the Inca. One of the most perplexing aspects of the Wari's sudden disappearance is the absence of any clear documentation or written record explaining their downfall. Unlike other great civilizations of the ancient world, such as the Egyptians or the Mesopotamians, the Wari did not leave behind a body of written texts, inscriptions, or codices to document their rise and fall. While some scholars believe the Wari may have used a form of quipu, knotted strings used by other Andean cultures, such as the Incas, for record-keeping, no direct evidence of such systems has been discovered at Wari or other Wari sites. This leaves historians with only material evidence: the stone ruins, the abandoned cities, and the artifacts that hint at the once great empire's culture and society. Could the Wari administration have experienced a sudden collapse, driven by internal political struggles or a breakdown of the central authority? The Wari were known for their highly organized state, which included a centralized government and a stratified society. The empire's rulers held absolute power, and it's possible that a shift in leadership or a succession crisis could have destabilized the system. Could the elite ruling class have been overthrown in a civil war or rebellion that weakened the empire from within? There is evidence that the Wari had a complex relationship with their subject peoples, and it's possible that the rapid expansion of the empire created tensions with local communities that ultimately led to their collapse. Alternatively, some have suggested that the collapse of the Wari administration may have been a more gradual and less violent process. The empire may have simply faded away, unable to cope with the changing environment and shifting political landscape of the region. The Andean highlands, with their rugged terrain and isolated communities, may have been prone to the rise of smaller, localized powers, each vying for control of the rich agricultural lands and trade routes once governed by the Wari. Over time, these smaller kingdoms and city-states may have absorbed the former Wari territories, leading to the gradual dissolution of the empire. But what if the Wari disappearance was not simply the result of environmental stress or political fragmentation? What if there is something more to the story, something that hasn't yet been uncovered? The lack of written records leaves a significant gap in our understanding of Wari history, but could the true cause of their downfall be buried beneath the soil, waiting to be discovered? Some archaeologists and historians have proposed more speculative theories, suggesting that the Wari may have faced a supernatural or spiritual crisis. Could there have been a religious upheaval that led to the collapse of the Wari administration? Was there a shift in spiritual or ideological beliefs that undermined the unity of the empire, leading to a breakdown in governance? The Wari ruins offer few clues about what happened to the people who once thrived there. What we do know is that the sudden disappearance of the Wari administration left a profound gap in Andean history. The Inca Empire, which would rise to prominence centuries later, did not seem to directly acknowledge the Wari, despite inheriting many of their architectural and agricultural practices. Did the Wari disappear so completely that their memory was erased, or was their downfall so deeply traumatic that it was deliberately forgotten? As we explore the ancient Wari ruins, standing amidst the stone terraces and massive structures, the silence is almost palpable. The walls of these once great cities, now crumbling and overrun by nature, seem to hold more questions than answers. What caused the administrative collapse of such a well-organized empire? Why did the Wari, who had mastered the art of urbanization and agriculture, abandon their cities so suddenly? Were they victims of natural forces beyond their control, or did they fall prey to internal conflicts that we will never fully understand? The story of the Wari's disappearance is far from over. New discoveries may yet shed light on the true reasons for the collapse of this remarkable civilization. Until then, the mystery remains, an unanswered question in the annals of Andean history, waiting for a deeper investigation into the lost empire of the Wari. What happened to the Wari administration, and what secrets might still lie hidden beneath the ruins of their once great cities? As we leave behind the mysteries of the Wari Empire, our journey now takes us north into the heart of Africa, where the ancient kingdom of Meroë once stood, an enigmatic civilization whose achievements in art, architecture, and culture rivaled the greatest empires of antiquity. Nestled along the banks of the Nile River in what is now Sudan, the Meroitic kingdom flourished for centuries, leaving behind monumental pyramids, elaborate tombs, and a rich cultural legacy. Yet, among the most puzzling aspects of Meroë's history is the disappearance of its writing system, the Meroitic script, a gap in the historical record that has remained largely unsolved. Meroë, once the capital of the Kingdom of Kush, was a civilization that thrived from the 8th century BC to the 4th century AD. The kingdom was a vibrant center of commerce, culture, and power, strategically situated along the Nile, which allowed it to control vital trade routes between Africa and the Mediterranean. The Meroites were skilled metallurgists, famous for their ironwork, and they developed a highly organized society with a complex bureaucracy and a pantheon of gods. Pyramids, similar to those of ancient Egypt but distinct in their style and construction, dot the landscape around the ancient city of Meroë, standing as silent witnesses to a civilization that was once as powerful as any in the ancient world. Despite their many achievements, the Meroites remain shrouded in mystery, largely due to the extinction of their writing system. The Meroitic script, which like other ancient writing systems was used for religious texts, royal inscriptions, and administrative purposes, has long puzzled scholars. Unlike the Egyptian hieroglyphs or the Mesopotamian cuneiform, Meroitic was a script that remained only partially understood, despite efforts to decipher it. The Meroitic language, too, has not been fully decoded, and much of the civilization's literature remains lost to time. The mystery deepens when we consider the fate of the Meroitic writing system. How did a civilization so advanced, with such a developed system of communication, lose its script and written record? The decline of Meroë, which began in the 4th century AD and continued into the 5th century, remains an unresolved enigma. The gradual disappearance of Meroitic script seems to coincide with the kingdom's political and cultural decline, but there is no clear record of why or how this writing system vanished. Unlike the collapse of civilizations such as the Roman Empire or the Maya civilization, where the loss of writing can be traced to external invasions, internal revolts, or environmental collapse, the disappearance of Meroitic writing seems to occur without a clear triggering event. Some historians argue that the decline of Meroë was due to a combination of external pressures from neighboring empires, such as the Romans to the north and the Axumites to the east. The Axumite Empire, based in what is now Ethiopia, eventually overpowered the Meroites in a series of military campaigns, causing the kingdom of Meroë to lose its dominance in the region. The Axumites, with their own distinct writing system and culture, may have absorbed or displaced the Meroitic civilization, leading to the eventual abandonment of Meroitic language and script. However, this theory does not fully explain the complete disappearance of the Meroitic script. After the fall of Meroë, many other Nubian kingdoms continued to use written records for centuries, such as the Old Nubian script, which was influenced by Coptic and other Egyptian scripts. The Axumites, too, had their own writing system, but it did not replace the Meroitic script in any immediate or direct way. Why, then, did Meroitic writing vanish so abruptly, with no clear successors or remnants to carry it forward? Could the Meroitic people themselves have abandoned their writing system voluntarily, possibly as a result of religious or cultural shifts? It's possible that as the Kushite kingdom experienced political and social changes, the importance of the written word diminished, and oral traditions took precedence. The spread of Christianity in the region during the 4th and 5th centuries AD could have also played a role in the decline of Meroitic culture, as Christianity brought with it new theological frameworks and cultural practices that might have superseded the older Meroitic traditions. In this context, the decline of Meroitic writing could have been part of a larger cultural transformation, where new ideologies and religious beliefs pushed aside older systems of knowledge and record-keeping. Alternatively, some scholars have suggested that the extinction of Meroitic writing may have been a result of climate change or environmental factors, similar to the environmental stressors that affected other ancient civilizations. The Nile, a lifeline for the Meroites, could have experienced fluctuations in its water levels, disrupting agricultural production and trade routes. Droughts or flooding could have caused massive social upheaval, further contributing to the collapse of the Meroitic administration and its cultural institutions. If the Meroites were forced to migrate or abandon their cities, the written traditions that once bound the civilization together could have been lost or forgotten in the process. Another theory suggests that the Meroitic script may have been intentionally suppressed or destroyed, either by the Axumites or by later conquerors who sought to erase the cultural identity of their predecessors. In the context of conquest, it was not uncommon for invading powers to deliberately destroy cultural artifacts, including written records, in order to assert their dominance and erase the memory of the civilization they had overthrown. In this case, the disappearance of Meroitic writing could be seen as part of the broader process of cultural assimilation and replacement that often accompanies the fall of a great empire. As we stand amidst the towering pyramids of Meroë, looking over the ruins of a once great civilization, the silence is deafening. The stone monuments that still stand as silent witnesses to the past seem to ask the same question. What happened to the writing of the Meroites? How could such a complex and advanced civilization, with its own distinct language and script, simply vanish without leaving behind a clear trace of its intellectual legacy? The disappearance of the Meroitic writing system remains one of the most compelling and unresolved mysteries of ancient history. Despite decades of research, the code that once unlocked the cultural and administrative life of the Meroitic people remains unbroken, and the civilization's written records are lost to time. As we continue to explore the ruins of Meroë, one thing becomes certain. The story of the Meroites, like so many other ancient peoples, is far from fully told. What we have uncovered only scratches the surface, and the deeper mysteries of the Meroitic script and its disappearance may still be waiting to be revealed. What caused the extinction of Meroitic writing? Was it an external invasion, an internal transformation, or something more complex? The answer may lie hidden in the sands of time, waiting for the right moment, or the right discovery, to bring it back to light. Until then, the Meroitic script remains one of the great mysteries of ancient civilization. As we leave behind the towering pyramids of Meroë, our journey now carries us across vast expanses of ocean, into the island nation of Japan, where a mystery lies buried in the ancient tombs of the Kofun period, a time that marked the rise of political complexity and power in early Japanese history. These massive burial mounds, called kofun, scatter the landscape of Japan, their distinctive keyhole shapes serving as silent monuments to a powerful and enigmatic age. Yet, for all their impressive physical presence, the political structures and rulers that these tombs were meant to honor remain shrouded in uncertainty, their identities and legacies largely lost to time. The Kofun period, approximately 300 AD to 600 AD, is a fascinating and transformative era in Japan's history, often considered the precursor to the formation of the Yamato state, the first unified kingdom of Japan. During this time, the Japanese archipelago saw the rise of large, elite burial mounds, which were constructed for the region's ruling elite. The tombs, some of which are massive in scale, suggest a society with highly organized labor and centralized control. At their peak, the Kofun tombs were surrounded by large moats, and often they contained elaborate grave goods, including weapons, pottery, jewels, and bronze mirrors, all signs of an emerging aristocracy and an increasingly complex political landscape. Yet for all the grandeur of the Kofun tombs, one key question remains unanswered. Who were the rulers of the Kofun period? What political system governed early Japan during this time? And why, despite the considerable archaeological evidence in the form of tombs, are so few names or written records available to help us understand the political structure that laid the foundation for Japan's first centralized state? The archaeological record from this period provides abundant evidence of a flourishing society, but it does not offer clear answers regarding the political institutions or leaders behind it. What is particularly striking about the Kofun period is the absence of written records. Japan's earliest historical texts, such as the Chronicles of Japan, or Nihon Shoki, and the Records of Ancient Matters, or Kojiki, were not written until centuries later, in the 7th and 8th centuries. This leaves us with little more than archaeological remains, the monumental tombs and some of the artifacts that accompanied the deceased, upon which to base our understanding of this early period. Most historians agree that the Kofun tombs are the final resting places of powerful regional chieftains or early rulers, but their identities remain largely speculative. The name Emperor Jimmu, often cited in Japanese mythology as the first ruler of Japan, is linked to this era, but there is little concrete evidence to confirm whether he existed or was purely a mythological figure. The Nihon Shoki, written long after the Kofun period had ended, mentions a powerful Yamato clan that would eventually dominate the region. However, the Yamato's rise to power is far from clear, and the exact political dynamics of the Kofun period remain an enigma. The gap in political documentation from the Kofun period has led to a number of competing theories about the political structure of early Japan. One prominent theory is that the early rulers of Japan operated as regional chiefs within a loose confederation, with the Kofun tombs serving as physical markers of territorial control. These tombs, often located in strategic positions across the archipelago, could represent the power centers of local elites who commanded authority over the surrounding population, but who did not yet hold a unified, centralized state. According to this theory, the Yamato clan eventually unified the disparate political entities of the archipelago and established the first centralized Japanese state, but the earlier history of political organization remains elusive. Another theory suggests that Japan was governed by a more structured monarchy during the Kofun period, but that the details of this centralized authority were lost over time, possibly due to the lack of written records or the destruction of early documents. In this view, the early Japanese monarchy may have been closely tied to religious and ritualistic practices, with rulers regarded as divine figures, a concept that would later evolve into the notion of the imperial family as the symbolic descendants of the gods in Japanese Shinto tradition. Some scholars speculate that the political gap we see in the historical record may be linked to the transition from a tribal society to a centralized kingdom, and that the rituals surrounding death and burial may have served as key mechanisms for asserting political authority. The mystery of the Kofun political gap deepens when considering the social structure of early Japan. While we know that the Kofun tombs were reserved for the elite, what we don't know is how power was distributed among the ruling classes. Who held the power within these societies? Were there rival factions or competing groups vying for dominance, or was there a single, unified political entity that ruled the archipelago? The Kofun tombs are largely viewed as symbols of political power, yet we are left to wonder what kind of political system underpinned their construction. Was there a centralized monarchy that exerted authority over all of Japan? Or were these rulers more akin to local warlords, each vying for control over different regions of the island? A more speculative theory proposes that the Kofun tombs were not solely political in nature, but also tied to religious or ritualistic practices. In this view, the construction of massive burial mounds may have been linked to the idea of a divine mandate, in which rulers were believed to be chosen by the gods to govern the land. This idea, though intriguing, is difficult to prove, as we have little to no written record from the period to corroborate such claims. Still, it is possible that the absence of clear political records is linked to the ritualistic nature of governance, where political power was inseparable from spiritual beliefs, and where rulers were seen as intermediaries between the gods and the people. The political vacuum left by the Kofun period remains one of the most compelling gaps in early Japanese history. As we stand among the monumental mounds of Kofun tombs, their towering presence invites us to imagine the world that once existed here, a world of rituals, ceremonies, and hierarchies that we can only begin to piece together. The silence that surrounds the Kofun period is deafening, but it is in this silence that the mystery lingers. What was the political structure that these monumental tombs served? How did the Yamato state rise to power? And why, despite all the grand burial sites, do we know so little about the rulers who lay beneath them? The answers to these questions may remain hidden in the ancient soil of Japan, waiting to be uncovered by future archaeological discoveries. Or perhaps the truth lies in the untold stories of the Kofun rulers themselves, forever lost in the sands of time. As we continue our exploration of the unexplained gaps in history, we turn now to the Korean Peninsula, a land where ancient kingdoms rose and fell, but where some of their earliest histories remain shrouded in silence. While the three kingdoms of Korea, Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla, have left behind vivid traces in historical records, the Proto-Korean period, the time before these kingdoms solidified their power, remains an enigma, particularly when it comes to political structures and the identities of early rulers. This gap in historical documentation is striking, especially when compared to the advanced writing systems of neighboring cultures such as China. What happened to the records of the early Korean proto-kingdoms, and why does their history seem to vanish into the shadows just as they were beginning to shape the landscape of East Asia? The landscape of ancient Korea is dotted with remnants of this mysterious past. One of the most notable is the ancient tombs scattered across the region, mounds of earth and stone that contain the remains of the elite, warriors, and rulers who once commanded the land. These coffin-like burial sites provide us with artifacts that offer a glimpse into the power structures of the time. The burial goods found within these tombs, bronze weapons, jewelry, pottery, and tools, speak of a complex society with rich traditions. Yet, the names of the individuals who were buried in these monumental tombs remain largely unknown. We are left with no written records, no inscriptions, no official documents to give us any further insight into their identities or the exact nature of their reigns. In the centuries following these tombs' construction, the Korean peninsula would undergo a dramatic transformation. From small tribal settlements, the proto-kingdoms would eventually evolve into the powerful three kingdoms, Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla, each leaving behind its own historical legacy. But the precise path leading from these early fragmented societies to the formation of powerful centralized kingdoms is a mystery that remains unsolved. Historically, the emergence of Goguryeo, the first of the three kingdoms, has been placed around the 1st century BC. Yet the formation of these early proto-kingdoms remains largely speculative, based on indirect sources and scant archaeological evidence. Chinese records mention these early kingdoms, but they are often vague and unreliable, providing more insight into their relationships with neighboring powers rather than the internal politics of these nascent states. Why is it that, despite centuries of recorded history and the rise of distinct political entities in China, the Proto-Korean period remains almost entirely absent from written accounts? This leads us to a peculiar question. Could there have been intentional gaps in the historical record? Could these early rulers have deliberately erased their political traces, or was the region's history simply ignored by the chroniclers of the time? We know that China, with its imperial bureaucracy and its role as a dominant cultural force, had a significant influence on the Korean peninsula, yet early Korean rulers seem to have left little in terms of written history. Some scholars speculate that the Proto-Korean kingdoms may have embraced oral traditions, passing down their stories not through written texts, but through spoken word and myth. Oral traditions can preserve a culture's history, but they can also be fragmented, distorted, and selective, leaving large gaps in our understanding of events and figures. As we dig deeper into the archaeological record, we see that material culture, the physical artifacts, offer clues but no direct answers. Artifacts such as pottery, bronze tools, and weapons suggest a highly developed society, but these objects do not tell us much about the political systems, the elites who ruled, or the struggles between the early kingdoms. Some historians suggest that the lack of written records may reflect a cultural preference for ritual over documentation. Perhaps the ruling elites of these proto-kingdoms didn't prioritize written texts or formal records, relying instead on symbolic displays of power and wealth to maintain their control. In the absence of written word, the tomb complexes, monumental burial mounds adorned with grand bronze ornaments and weapons, become the sole testimony to their existence. However, there are deeper layers to this mystery that demand our attention. Could it be that the Korean proto-kingdoms were in the process of transitioning from a tribal society to a more centralized political system? The formation of centralized kingdoms, which would later give rise to Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla, would have required significant changes in political organization, from small, loosely connected groups to more powerful, organized states. This shift would likely have involved the integration of various ethnic and cultural groups on the peninsula, leading to conflicts and negotiations that might not have been well documented. Could it be that the silence we encounter in the historical record is a reflection of the fragmentation of the proto-kingdoms or the chaos of early unification? Did the absence of written records reflect the fluidity and instability of this formative period? There is another theory that suggests the lack of political documentation could be due to the early Korean kingdoms' reliance on shamanistic or religious systems to validate their authority. In early Korean societies, spiritual beliefs were closely tied to political leadership. Rulers were often seen as divinely appointed or as intermediaries between the human and the spiritual realms. Could the silence in the historical record be a reflection of this divine connection? Perhaps the rulers of the proto-kingdoms did not feel the need for written records, as their power was assumed to be inherited from the gods or spiritually ordained, making historical accounts unnecessary. In the absence of written history, we are left to speculate. Did the early rulers of these kingdoms simply not record their histories, or did circumstances, such as the decline of certain proto-kingdoms or the destruction of records during invasions, contribute to the silence? What else could have caused such a gap in political documentation, especially during a time of significant cultural and political development? As we step away from the tombs and burial sites of ancient Korea, we are left with more questions than answers. The absence of written history from the early Korean proto-kingdoms speaks not only to the enigmatic nature of their political systems, but also to the limitations of our understanding of early East Asian civilizations. With the clues we have, the archaeological remains, the oral traditions, and the vague references in Chinese records, we can begin to piece together a narrative. Yet, like so many other mysterious periods in history, much remains hidden. What truths are buried in the gaps of history? And what might still be waiting to be discovered beneath the surface of the Korean peninsula's rich, though elusive past? Deep within the dense, shadowed forests of Europe, where towering trees seem to hold secrets of forgotten ages, lies one of the most intriguing mysteries of ancient history, the Celtic continental collapse gap. This enigma, stretching from roughly the 3rd to the 1st century BC, marks a period of sudden and unexplained disappearance of the once dominant Celtic tribes across much of Europe. A civilization that had flourished for centuries, spreading its influence from the British Isles to modern-day Turkey, seemed to vanish almost overnight, leaving behind very little in the way of records, artifacts, or clear explanations. The Celts were no minor peoples. They were formidable warriors, skilled craftsmen, and creators of a vibrant culture that thrived across much of Europe. The evidence of their once great civilization is found in the remains of hill forts, intricate metalwork, and the vast network of trade routes that spanned from the Atlantic coast to the far reaches of the Danube. Their culture, known for its rich oral traditions, artistic expression, and complex social structures, left an indelible mark on the history of Europe. Yet, during this mysterious period, the archaeological record becomes increasingly sparse, as if a veil has descended over the Celtic world. What could have caused such an abrupt and almost complete collapse of a people so deeply entrenched in the fabric of pre-Roman Europe? For centuries, scholars have sought an answer, often settling on the most straightforward explanation: the rise of Rome. The powerful Roman Empire, with its disciplined legions and vast infrastructure, expanded relentlessly throughout the Mediterranean and into the heart of Celtic territories. By the time Julius Caesar marched into Gaul in the mid-1st century BC, much of the Celtic world had already been absorbed into the Roman sphere, its tribes either defeated or forced to submit to Roman rule. On the surface, this explanation makes sense. Rome's military might and its imperialistic ambitions would have been a significant factor in the Celtic collapse. Yet this theory doesn't account for the suddenness of the Celtic disappearance. If the Roman Empire was the primary cause of their downfall, why is there so little evidence of the Celts in the decades leading up to Caesar's conquest? Why do the records, both Roman and Celtic, seem to vanish before the Romans even began their full-scale campaign in Gaul? One possible answer lies in the environmental challenges that the Celts may have faced. The period from the 3rd to the 1st century BC was marked by significant climatic shifts. Some historians point to the late Holocene cooling, a period of temperature drop that affected much of Europe and could have led to crop failures, famines, and destabilization of the Celtic communities. If agriculture, the lifeblood of Celtic society, had been severely impacted, it could have led to internal strife, weakened trade networks, and a general collapse of social structures. However, this theory remains speculative. While climate changes are certainly known to have impacted societies throughout history, the Celts were a resilient people, known for their ability to adapt to harsh conditions. It seems unlikely that they would have been undone solely by a cooling climate, especially when other cultures of the time, including the Romans themselves, weathered similar environmental shifts. So, if climate was a factor, why did it hit the Celts so devastatingly hard? Another theory focuses on internal divisions within Celtic society. The Celts were not a single unified people, but a collection of tribes with distinct languages, customs, and political structures. Could it have been internal conflict that weakened them so thoroughly? The Celts were known for their warrior culture, and internal power struggles, factionalism, and rivalries might have left them fragmented and vulnerable to external threats. By the time the Romans arrived, the Celts may have been so divided that they could no longer mount a united defense. But even this theory has its holes. While some Celtic tribes certainly fell to infighting, many others continued to resist Roman expansion for centuries. The tribes of Britain and Ireland, for instance, would continue to fight against Roman occupation long after their continental cousins had been absorbed. If the collapse was due to internal division, why did some regions of the Celtic world manage to hold out for much longer? This is where the mystery deepens. While the rise of Rome and internal division offer plausible explanations, they still don't fully account for the suddenness of the collapse. There are whispers among some historians that the answer might lie in something more elusive, something beyond the boundaries of known history. Could there have been an external force that contributed to the fall of the Celts? Some researchers have suggested the possibility of contact with unknown or mysterious peoples, perhaps even from distant lands. The Etruscans, for example, were a sophisticated civilization that predated the Romans and had trade connections with the Celts. Did they play a role in shaping the fate of the Celts during this period? Or perhaps the mysterious Illyrians, a people often associated with ancient European tribes, had an influence on the Celts that we do not yet understand. There is even speculation about the Celts undergoing some kind of spiritual or philosophical transformation that led to their withdrawal from the wider world. Known for their mystical and druidic traditions, could the Celts have experienced a collective crisis of belief or a shift in their cultural identity that led to their retreat? It's a theory that borders on the fringe, but it speaks to the mysterious nature of the Celtic worldview and their deep connection to the unseen forces of nature. Yet, none of these ideas can be definitively proven. What we know for certain is that the Celtic world, which once stood as a powerful cultural and military force, began to fade away with little trace. As we examine the archaeological record, we find fewer and fewer clues as to what happened. The Celts seem to vanish, leaving behind only fragments of their culture scattered across the continent. Some of these fragments are poignant reminders of what was lost. In the hills of Gaul, the remains of once great hill forts stand as silent sentinels to the past. In Ireland and Britain, ancient burial mounds and stone circles speak of a people whose influence extended far beyond the boundaries of what we now know as Celtic lands. Yet, there is no clear answer to what happened to them. How could a civilization so advanced, so interconnected, so vibrant, simply disappear from history? The gap in the Celtic record remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of ancient Europe. Was it Rome, with its legions and imperial power, that caused the collapse? Or was it something else? An environmental catastrophe, internal strife, or something even more mysterious that we have yet to uncover? As we continue to explore the unexplained gaps in history, we are left with more questions than answers. The mystery of the Celtic collapse reminds us that, despite our advances in archaeology and history, there are still pieces of the past that lie just beyond our grasp. What else is hidden, waiting to be discovered, buried beneath layers of time and forgotten by all but the oldest trees in the deepest forests? What secrets of the Celtic world remain to be uncovered, and what truths might still be lying in wait, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves? And perhaps, as we consider these questions, we must ask ourselves, how much of our own history, too, is shrouded in mystery, waiting for the future to uncover the hidden threads of the past? As we move from the familiar echoes of ancient civilizations to the enigmatic silence of lost cultures, we find ourselves standing at the edge of an extraordinary mystery, a vast, unexplained gap in history that has haunted scholars for centuries. The Celtic continental collapse gap is one such mystery. It is a period from approximately the 3rd to the 1st century BC, when the once flourishing Celtic civilizations, which had spread from the British Isles to the plains of Central Europe and even into parts of Asia Minor, seemed to vanish from the historical record. This sudden disappearance has left behind a chilling silence in the archaeological and historical landscape, one that continues to baffle researchers today. Imagine, if you will, the land that once resonated with the vibrant and dynamic culture of the Celts, a people whose identity was woven from a tapestry of art, craftsmanship, religion, and warfare. Picture the dense, fog-shrouded forests of Gaul, the rolling hills of the British Isles, and the fertile plains of Central Europe. These were lands shaped by the Celts, communities thriving in large, fortified hill settlements known as oppida, with complex trade networks that spanned the continent, exchanging goods, ideas, and customs. Their distinct artistic style, intricate metalwork, beautifully adorned weapons, and exquisite jewelry showed a people of sophistication and craft. The Celts were not simply a warrior society. They were a people deeply attuned to the land, with a belief system rooted in the spiritual forces of nature and the mystical. Yet, as the 3rd century BC turned into the 1st century BC, something changed. The familiar symbols of Celtic culture, the weapons, the artwork, the ritual sites, began to disappear. Evidence of their settlements grew scarce, and what remained appeared abandoned or altered. By the time Julius Caesar crossed the Rhine and led his conquest of Gaul, much of the Celtic world seemed to be in disarray, as though some invisible force had swept through and left the land in ruin. How could a civilization so vast and influential simply fade away? What happened to the Celtic peoples who once controlled such a significant portion of Europe? Was it the expansion of Rome, as many historians claim, that brought their world to a close? Or could there have been other forces at play, perhaps environmental, internal, or even spiritual, that led to their fall? The most widely accepted explanation for the collapse of the Celtic continental world is the rise of Rome. By the 1st century BC, Rome was expanding rapidly, and its legions were marching through Gaul and other Celtic territories. Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul between 58 to 50 BC marks the high point of Roman influence over Celtic lands. But it was not the only time the Romans encountered the Celts. The Roman legions had been pushing into Celtic territories for centuries, and with their advanced military strategy, discipline, and political acumen, they brought many Celtic tribes under their control. It is easy to assume, then, that the Celts simply couldn't compete with the might of Rome. The Romans, after all, had superior organization, weaponry, and tactics. They created infrastructure that facilitated their expansion: roads, fortifications, and systems of governance. For a fragmented and often fractious society like the Celts, this would have been a daunting challenge. And yet, while the Romans certainly played a major role in the decline of Celtic power, this explanation feels incomplete. It doesn't account for the abruptness and extent of the collapse, nor does it explain the seeming disappearance of the Celts in the archaeological record before Roman conquest even began in earnest. A deeper look into the timeline of Celtic decline reveals some intriguing environmental factors that may have contributed to the collapse. The late Holocene period, which spans the 3rd to 1st centuries BC, was marked by shifts in climate that affected many regions of Europe. During this time, the Earth experienced a cooling phase, and certain areas, particularly in the north and west of Europe, saw harsher winters and shorter growing seasons. Could such climatic changes have had a significant impact on Celtic society? After all, the Celts were an agrarian society, and crop failure due to poor weather could have caused widespread famine, unrest, and societal breakdown. We know that in other periods of history, such shifts in climate have led to the collapse of civilizations. The harsh climate conditions could have led to agricultural shortages, making it difficult for Celtic communities to sustain their populations and their elaborate social structures. However, this theory raises more questions than answers. The Celts were known for their adaptability. They had endured various environmental challenges for centuries. Could the Celts have been undone by climate change alone? Or was there something more at work? And, more critically, if climatic shifts had indeed caused widespread disruption, why did this impact the Celts so severely, while other civilizations, including the Romans, managed to weather the storm? Another explanation for the collapse points to internal strife within Celtic society. The Celts were not a single, unified civilization, but rather a collection of tribes, each with its own language, customs, and political structures. While there was a shared cultural identity, the Celts were often divided by rivalries, infighting, and competition for dominance. The social fabric was fragile, and when external pressures, whether from the Romans or other forces, began to bear down, the Celtic tribes may have been unable to unite in their defense. Evidence from Roman records suggests that the Celts were often at odds with one another, even during moments of conflict with outside forces. The political landscape of the Celts was not one of centralized control, but rather a patchwork of local chieftains and clans. When faced with a unified, militarily superior force like the Romans, internal division could have been the death knell for Celtic power. And yet, there is still something unsettling about this explanation. Many Celtic tribes were formidable in their own right, with armies that could rival Rome's in skill and strength. Even as Rome expanded, certain Celtic tribes in the British Isles continued to resist Roman occupation for centuries. So why, if internal division was the primary cause of their collapse, did some Celtic tribes hold out much longer than others? And if they were so divided, why did the Celts remain a potent force in some regions, even as their continental cousins fell? As we dig deeper into the mystery of the Celtic collapse, we encounter more speculative theories, some of which push the boundaries of historical investigation. Could the disappearance of the Celts have been influenced by external forces far beyond the Roman Empire? Some fringe theories propose the possibility of contact with other, as yet unknown, peoples or civilizations, possibly from distant regions of the east or the north. One possibility is that the Celts encountered peoples whose influence was so profound that it caused a cultural or spiritual transformation. Could there have been a radical shift in their worldview, a sort of collective crisis of identity that led them to abandon their former way of life? The Celts were a deeply spiritual people, with a belief system centered around the mystical forces of nature. If they experienced some kind of collective trauma, whether environmental, military, or even metaphysical, it may have led to their retreat from the wider world. Another, even more speculative theory suggests that the Celts were in possession of knowledge or spiritual practices that were lost to time. Some suggest the possibility of an ancient and advanced civilization, now long forgotten, whose influence may have been felt by the Celts. This civilization, whether real or imagined, may have left an indelible mark on the Celts, pushing them to withdraw from the larger world stage in ways we may never fully understand. The theory that the Celts disappeared due to some mystical or esoteric event remains fringe, but it highlights the profound sense of mystery that surrounds their collapse. Was it truly the might of Rome, the pressures of internal conflict, or environmental change that brought down the Celtic world? Or was there something far more elusive at play, something that we are only beginning to glimpse? Standing in the silence of the ancient Celtic hill forts, with the wind whispering through the trees, one can't help but wonder, what happened to the Celts? How could such a powerful, vibrant people simply vanish? Did they succumb to the might of Rome, or was their fate tied to forces beyond our comprehension? Could there still be forgotten truths hidden in the mists of time, waiting to be uncovered? The truth, it seems, remains just beyond reach. The Celtic continental collapse gap continues to be one of history's most compelling mysteries, a puzzle that, despite centuries of investigation, refuses to yield its secrets. But perhaps that is what makes it so powerful. As we look to the past, we realize that not all gaps in history are meant to be filled. Some mysteries are meant to remain just that, mysteries, calling us to continue the search, to keep digging, to ask the questions that will one day, perhaps, reveal the untold story of the Celts and their sudden, enigmatic disappearance. And as we continue our journey into history's unexplained gaps, we must ask, how many other forgotten peoples, lost to time, are waiting for their story to be told? What other pieces of history lie buried beneath the surface, waiting for us to uncover, as the Baltic Sea stretches across the northern part of Europe, with its waves gently lapping against the shores of what are now Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and the Polish coast, there lies an enigma that stretches back to the dawn of recorded history. It is here, amidst dense forests and windswept plains, that one of Europe's most mysterious pagan traditions once flourished. The Baltic paganism of the proud and independent tribes that lived by ancient customs, worshipped nature, and revered spirits of the land, sky, and water. But when we look deeper into the history of the Baltic peoples, a strange gap appears, a sudden transition from ancient pagan beliefs to the rise of Christianity. an event that seems to have unfolded with an unsettling abruptness. The Baltic pagan transition gap is one of the more fascinating and perplexing chapters in the history of Eastern Europe, marked by both a vibrant cultural heritage and an equally mysterious disappearance of the old ways. How did these ancient pagan traditions, which seemed so deeply rooted in the Baltic landscape, suddenly fade into the annals of history? What happened to the religions of the Prussians, the Latvians, the Lithuanians, and their kin as they were slowly drawn into the orbit of Christianity? In the 8th century AD, the Baltic region was still a place where ancient gods were worshipped in sacred groves, where rituals to Perkunas, the thunder god, were performed with great reverence, and where the spirit of nature was honored in ways that have since become difficult to imagine. The early medieval Baltic tribes had no unified political or religious structure, but rather a collection of closely knit, fiercely independent groups, each with their own variations of pagan traditions. These were societies that lived in harmony with nature, where pagan sacrifices to ancient deities were made at holy sites, and where the understanding of the universe was closely tied to the changing seasons and natural cycles. The archaeological record from this time reveals much about these ancient societies. Slender bronze pendants, gilded sculptures, and rune stones bearing inscriptions that honor their gods. But the shift to Christianity is far more difficult to trace. Why, in the space of a few centuries, did these beliefs and the vibrant cultures that upheld them begin to disappear? Some of the earliest Christian missionaries reached the Baltic tribes as early as the 10th century, but it wasn't until the 13th century that significant conversion efforts were made. And yet, the transition wasn't a simple process of religious change. It was a cultural upheaval marked by violent conflicts, forceful conversions, and the eventual collapse of pagan structures. To understand this transition, one must first grasp the significance of the Baltic peoples within the larger context of medieval Europe. The Baltic region was surrounded by powerful Christian kingdoms and states, such as Poland, Denmark, and the Holy Roman Empire, each of which sought to expand their influence over the Baltic tribes. The Crusades against the pagan Prussians in the 12th century stand as one of the clearest markers of this religious clash. The Teutonic Knights, a military order based in Prussia, played a pivotal role in the forced conversion of the Prussians, Lithuanians, and Latvians during the Northern Crusades. This period saw the destruction of pagan temples, the forced baptism of tribal leaders, and the imposition of Christian practices that replaced centuries-old rituals. But the evidence suggests that the process of conversion wasn't purely religious. It was also political and military. The Knights and Crusaders often used Christianity as a tool for domination, subjugating the pagan peoples to their authority and forcibly dissolving the independent nature of their societies. Despite the efforts of the Teutonic Order, the pagan beliefs of the Lithuanians and Prussians were not entirely extinguished. In fact, Lithuania remains one of the last pagan strongholds in Europe. The official conversion of Lithuania to Christianity did not occur until 1387, long after other European nations had adopted the faith. But why did it take so long for these pagan beliefs to give way to Christianity? Some historians suggest that the Lithuanians were particularly resistant to the spread of Christianity, seeing it as a foreign imposition on their sacred way of life. Others argue that the political and military pressure brought to bear by the Crusaders, along with the strategic alliances made by Lithuania with neighboring Christian powers, were the primary factors that eventually led to the adoption of Christianity. Still, there is a palpable mystery surrounding the precise nature of the transition. Why, in the span of a few centuries, did the Baltic pagan religions give way to an entirely new religious system? Was it a gradual process, a merging of the old and new, or was it a more violent and abrupt transformation? The archaeological evidence offers us few answers. Pagan sacred groves were destroyed, but the gods of the old pantheon were not forgotten entirely. Traces of paganism can still be found today in Lithuanian folk traditions, festivals, and even in the symbols that are still cherished in the region. Some have suggested that certain elements of Baltic paganism may have been hidden, with the people continuing to venerate their old gods in secrecy, even as they adopted Christian practices. This raises an important question. Could the pagan traditions of the Baltic tribes have survived longer than we think, surviving in the quiet recesses of folk culture and memory? Some suggest that the disappearance of Baltic paganism was not a single event, but rather the result of a slow cultural assimilation, where the old ways were subtly integrated into the new Christian framework. In some cases, Christian saints were associated with pagan deities, and pagan festivals were reinterpreted as Christian celebrations, such as the winter solstice festival of Yule, which over time evolved into Christmas. What we are left with today is an intriguing puzzle. The gap between the old pagan beliefs and the rise of Christianity in the Baltic region. Did the transition happen so swiftly because of external pressures? Or was there something more profound at play, something that has yet to be fully understood? The Baltic pagan transition gap remains one of the most tantalizing mysteries of medieval European history, and perhaps the answers lie buried in the remnants of ancient pagan sites, waiting for future generations to uncover. What remains hidden beneath the earth and within the forgotten corners of the Baltic consciousness might one day reveal truths that history has long kept locked away.